In the blood-soaked annals of Imperial history, certain wars stand as monuments to horror, their details purposefully obscured by those who understand that some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. Among these deliberately shadowed conflicts, none loom larger than the Rangdan Xenocides, a series of apocalyptic campaigns that nearly brought the Emperor's Great Crusade to its knees during the 30th millennium. The classification of the Rangdan Xenocides as among the most devastating conflicts of the Great Crusade era isn't mere hyperbole, but a stark assessment drawn from the fragments of information that have survived Imperial censorship. Historical documents from this period refer to the Rangdan campaigns as the first wound inflicted upon the nascent Imperium, conflicts of such ferocity and loss that they permanently altered the trajectory of humanity's expansion into the stars. What makes these wars particularly noteworthy is the extraordinary measures taken to erase them from collective memory. Unlike other major campaigns of the Great Crusade, which are celebrated in Imperial histories, the Rangdan Xenocides exist primarily as redacted passages, sealed archives, and information classified at levels accessible only to the highest echelons of Imperial authority. This systematic erasure speaks volumes about the nature of the threat, something the Imperium deemed too dangerous to remember, even in an empire built upon the lessons of past conflicts. The few surviving records indicate that the Adeptus Terra, likely under direct orders from the Emperor himself, purged vast data repositories of information pertaining to the Rangdan. Entire sections of historical chronicles covering these campaigns appear as nothing more than black lines on parchment, or data blocks marked with the highest classification runes. Tech priests who maintain the great archival cogitators of Mars whisper that certain memory cores from this era were not merely wiped but physically destroyed, their materials reduced to slag under thermal weapons. This institutional amnesia was so thoroughly implemented that even Space Marine legions who participated in the campaigns have incomplete records. The Dark Angels archives, typically meticulous in their documentation of Legion deployments, contain curious chronological gaps precisely corresponding to the estimated timeframes of the Xenocide campaigns. Similarly, the few surviving veterans who fought in these wars were either sworn to absolute secrecy or subjected to psycho-conditioning to blur their recollections. What we do know, pieced together from fragmentary sources and oblique references in less censored texts, is that the Rangdan Xenocides comprised 3 distinct major campaigns spanning approximately 4 decades during the middle period of the Great Crusade. The first Rangdan Xenocide erupted around the year 862 of the 30th millennium, roughly a century after the Great Crusade began. This initial conflict marked humanity's first contact with what Imperial taxonomists would later classify as Slogth-murder minds, entities believed to be either allied with or controlling the primary Rangdan species. The theater of war centered around the northwestern fringes of the galaxy, in what would later be designated the Halo Stars region. Early expeditionary fleets that ventured into this region simply disappeared without communication, their loss initially attributed to warp storms or navigational hazards rather than hostile action. The second Rangdan Xenocide, beginning approximately 881, represented a significant escalation. By this point, the Imperium recognized the existential threat posed by these xenos and deployed unprecedented military resources to contain their expansion. This campaign saw the heaviest involvement of the Dark Angels Legion, with fragmentary records suggesting the Emperor himself took direct command of certain operations during this phase. The conflict spread across multiple sectors and reportedly resulted in casualties so severe that entire expedition fleets and their accompanying Titan legions were listed as operational losses too severe to reconstitute. The third and final Xenocide campaign, occurring around the 899th year of the 30th millennium, represented the Imperium's ultimate push to exterminate the Rangdan threat. This campaign involved multiple Space Marine legions operating in concert, with some sources suggesting that the mysterious and formidable Pale Wasting, another redacted threat from this era, may have been somehow connected to this final phase of the conflict. The chronological placement of these campaigns within the broader Great Crusade timeline is significant. They occurred during what Imperial historians later termed the Middle Crusade, after the initial rapid expansion from Terra, but before the discovery of many Primarchs. This timing is crucial, as it suggests that the Imperium faced this existential threat while still building toward its full military potential, with several Legion Primarchs either undiscovered or newly reunited with their forces. The nature of the Rangdan themselves remains one of the most closely guarded secrets in Imperial records. Unlike other xenos species encountered during the Great Crusade, orcs, Eldar, or even the insidious lair, comprehensive biological, technological, and societal information about the Rangdan is virtually non-existent in accessible archives. What little can be pieced together suggests a species of terrifying capability. They emerged from the halo stars, the sparse region of ancient stars that forms a ring around the outer edge of the galaxy. This region has long been associated with strange phenomena, lost human colonies that developed in isolation during the Age of Strife, and xeno civilizations untouched by major galactic powers. Fragmentary descriptions that survived censorship depict the Rangdan as a highly advanced species with biotechnology that rivaled or even surpassed certain aspects of Dark Age humanity. They possess the ability to corrupt and subvert other biological organisms, including humans and possibly even Astartes. Some texts make oblique references to cerebral parasites and macrocellular viral agents deployed against Imperial forces, suggesting bioweapons of horrific sophistication. The Rangdan command structure, apparently centered around entities described in classified Ordo Xenos files as Slogth murder minds, beings of immense psychic potential who could dominate lesser organisms. Whether these were the Rangdan themselves or a separate species in alliance with them remains unclear. Some xenobiologists who have accessed limited records theorize that the Rangdan might have been a confederation of multiple xeno species under the control of these murder minds, rather than a single biological species. Their technology displayed capabilities that alarmed even the Mechanicum. Rangdan vessels could apparently phase in and out of conventional reality in ways different from standard warp travel, making their movements unpredictable and their attacks sudden. Their weapon systems could corrupt machine spirits and penetrate void shields through unknown means. Most disturbing were accounts of life-eater weapons that bore similarities to virus bombs, but with selective targeting capabilities that suggested a profound understanding of genetic manipulation. The threat posed by the Rangdan was not merely military, but existential. Unlike many xenos encountered during the Great Crusade who fought for territory or resources, fragmentary evidence suggests the Rangdan sought to fundamentally alter or consume human biology itself. Some heavily redacted inquisitorial texts refer to entire human populations, transformed, rather than simply conquered, their genetic material and consciousness subverted to serve Rangdan purposes. The geographical origin of the Rangdan invasion came from the region beyond the halo stars, possibly from intergalactic space itself. This origin point contributed to the strategic challenge they presented. While most threats to the expanding Imperium came from within the galaxy as human forces expanded outward, the Rangdan struck from beyond the frontier, attacking newly compliant worlds and established supply lines alike. Imperial military planners were forced to fight a multi-front war against an enemy that could appear virtually anywhere along the northwestern expansion front. This strategic vulnerability required the Emperor to commit some of his most powerful assets to the conflict, including the full might of the First Legion, the Dark Angels, who at that time were considered the largest and most powerful of all Space Marine legions. The cost of victory against the Rangdan cannot be overstated. Conservative estimates drawn from fragmentary fleet records suggest losses in the millions among Imperial Army personnel, with entire expeditionary fleets lost with all hands. More alarming are the carefully hidden records of Astartes casualties. The Dark Angels Legion alone may have lost as many as 50,000 Astartes during the campaigns, losses so severe that despite being one of the largest legions at the outset of the Xenocides, they were significantly reduced in number by the time of the Horus heresy. Even Titan legions suffered grievous losses. The Legio Vulturum is recorded as having been reduced to a single operational engine following one particularly devastating engagement, while other Mechanicum forces reported unprecedented contamination of their systems by unknown techno-organic agents that required complete purging of affected machines. What makes the Rangdan particularly notable in the blood-soaked history of the Imperium is not merely the scale of the conflict, but the evident fear they inspired in Imperial leadership. Few threats have warranted such comprehensive information control. Even knowledge of chaos was more widely distributed among Imperial forces prior to the Horus heresy than information about the Rangdan and their capabilities. The first documented contact between Imperial forces and the Rangdan occurred in the year 824 of the 30th millennium, when Expeditionary Fleet 106, commanded by Lord Commander Perister, ventured beyond the established boundaries of Imperial cartography into the galactic northeast fringe. Fleet 106 was a substantial force consisting of 3 capital ships, 12 escorts, and approximately 20,000 Imperial army troops, supported by Mechanicum assets, including a demi-legio of knights from House Orlac. Their mission had been straightforward: to explore and bring compliance to several star systems detected by long-range auger arrays. Initial astrographic surveys had identified potential human settlements in these regions, likely isolated colonies that had survived the Age of Strife. What they encountered instead would become the first chapter in one of the Imperium's most devastating conflicts. The initial contact was deceptively mundane. Fleet 106 established orbit around a temperate world designated 3XX16, which showed signs of advanced infrastructure and technology. Preliminary scans detected power signatures consistent with Dark Age human settlements. Lord Commander Perister, following standard protocol, dispatched a reconnaissance force to establish first contact with what he presumed were lost human colonists. The reconnaissance force, consisting of 3 companies of Imperial army troops and a detachment of Mechanicum exploratory units, made planetfall near a sprawling metropolis of curved, organic-looking structures. Vox transmissions from the ground forces described architecture that seemed to blur the line between construction and growth, buildings that appeared to have been grown rather than built, with surfaces that exhibited subtle movements as if breathing. The last coherent transmission from the ground force came 18 hours after landing. It described encountering bipedal entities moving among the structures, entities initially thought to be human, but which displayed unsettling fluidity of movement and asymmetrical facial structures. The transmission cut off mid-sentence, replaced by a burst of binary code that, when later analyzed by Mechanicum specialists, appeared to contain complex biological data patterns rather than any recognizable communication protocol. When Commander Perister lost contact with his ground forces, he dispatched a second, larger force including heavy armor support. This force also went silent within hours of making planetfall. The commander, now recognizing the serious nature of the threat, prepared to implement quarantine protocols and withdraw to safe distance to report to Imperial command. It was already too late. 3 previously undetected vessels emerged from the night side of 3XX16. Witnesses described them as elongated, segmented structures resembling arthropod exoskeletons, approximately 3 kilometers in length. These vessels did not register on traditional auger arrays until they were within weapons range, suggesting some form of advanced stealth technology. The ensuing void battle was brief and devastating. The unknown vessels emitted directed energy weapons that appeared to bypass void shields entirely, striking directly at the material structure of the Imperial ships. More alarmingly, they deployed some form of boarding mechanism, described in surviving accounts as tendrils of living metal that breached hull integrity and allowed boarding parties to enter the Imperial vessels. The boarding forces represented the first documented encounter with what would later be classified as Rangdan shock troops. Surviving pick captures show humanoid figures with elongated limbs and torsos wrapped in chitinous armor. Their heads were encased in helmets with multiple sensory apparatuses, giving them an insectoid appearance. Most disturbing were their weapons, organic-looking devices that fired parasites capable of burrowing through armor and into the flesh of their victims. Within 6 hours, all but one of Fleet 106's vessels had been captured or destroyed. The lone survivor, the fast frigate Emperor's Wisdom, executed an emergency warp jump with severe damage to its Geller field generators. When it emerged at the nearest Imperial outpost 3 weeks later, the crew was found to be either dead or in various stages of physiological transformation. Quarantine protocols were immediately implemented, and the vessel was destroyed by order of the attending Magos biologists. The data recovered from the Emperor's Wisdom's cogitators provided the Imperium with its first glimpse of the Rangdan threat. The ship's Medicae logs documented a progressive infection that began with small, worm-like parasites entering through the victim's auditory canals, eyes, or other orifices. These parasites migrated to the brain stem, where they developed into complex structures that interfaced with the host's nervous system. Infected individuals remained conscious and apparently themselves for days or even weeks, all while the parasite gradually assumed control of higher brain functions. Most alarming was evidence that infected crew members had attempted to sabotage the ship's navigation systems to return it to Rangdan-controlled space. This indicated that the parasites not only controlled their hosts, but could access their knowledge and technical expertise. The implications were clear. The Rangdan possessed the means to turn the Imperium's own forces against it through biological subversion. The destruction of Fleet 106 marked only the beginning. In the months that followed, 17 additional expeditionary fleets operating in the galactic northeast reported contact with similar vessels before going silent. Imperial outposts along the expansion frontier began reporting unusual behavior among personnel, followed by communications blackouts. By 826, the Imperium had lost contact with over 30 newly compliant worlds in the region. The pattern of contamination moved with alarming speed. The Rangdan appeared to follow a consistent strategy: initial infiltration using parasitic organisms, subversion of local leadership and defense forces, establishment of larger beachheads for their primary forces, and then rapid expansion to neighboring systems. Worlds that fell to the Rangdan underwent disturbing transformations. Orbital pict captures showed urban centers being dismantled and reconstructed into sprawling, hive-like structures that served unknown purposes. Industrial facilities were repurposed to produce biological materials rather than conventional manufacturing. Most concerning was the fate of human populations on conquered worlds. Unlike many xenos species encountered during the Great Crusade that simply eradicated human inhabitants, the Rangdan appeared to preserve them, but not in any recognizable form. Imperial forces that later managed to briefly reclaim some of these worlds discovered processing facilities where humans were systematically modified. Some were transformed into host bodies for cerebral parasites, becoming extensions of the Rangdan collective consciousness. Others underwent more extensive physiological alterations, their bodies reshaping into forms better suited for specific tasks within Rangdan society. The Rangdan did not limit their conquest to human worlds. Evidence suggests they assimilated at least 3 previously unknown xenos species indigenous to the region, modifying them to serve as proxy armies. These enslaved species formed the bulk of Rangdan ground forces in the early stages of the conflict. Mechanicum xenobiologists classified these proxy forces into 3 broad categories. The vassals were bipedal organisms standing approximately 2 meters tall with 4 upper limbs. Their original species appeared to have been a primitive but physically powerful race native to high-gravity worlds. Under Rangdan control, they were equipped with crude but effective armor fashioned from their own hardened bodily secretions and armed with weapons that fired barbed projectiles containing neurotoxins. The Shrouds were smaller entities that appeared to have once been an avian species. Rangdan modifications had rendered them almost incorporeal, their bodies emitting a constant cloud of microscopic organisms that could penetrate sealed environments and cause hallucinations in those who inhaled them. Shrouds were primarily used for infiltration and psychological warfare. Most formidable were the Void Swimmers, massive, whale-like entities capable of surviving in vacuum. These creatures, measuring up to 500 meters in length, served as living transports for Rangdan forces and could generate powerful electromagnetic fields that disrupted Vox communications and auger arrays. Their cavernous internal chambers could carry thousands of troops and vehicles. These proxy armies formed the vanguard of Rangdan expansion, with the true Rangdan themselves, or their controlling intelligence, rarely seen in direct combat during this early phase. This strategic approach allowed the Rangdan to conserve their core forces while testing Imperial military capabilities through their proxies. The Imperium's initial response to the Rangdan threat was hampered by several factors. First was simple disbelief. The reports from the frontier were so outlandish that many Imperial commanders suspected exaggeration or misidentification of known xenos species. Second was the rapid pace of Rangdan expansion, which outstripped the Imperium's ability to redirect sufficient forces to contain it. Third, and perhaps most critically, was the effectiveness of Rangdan infiltration tactics. By the time the Imperium recognized the full scope of the threat, Rangdan cerebral parasites had already compromised several key command structures in the sector. The turning point came when an Imperial administratum outpost on Advex Moors detected unusual behavior among its senior staff. The garrison commander, suspecting warp influence corruption, executed emergency protocols and placed the facility under lockdown. Astropathic communications were sent directly to Terra, bypassing the sector command which was suspected of compromise. The message reached the Emperor himself, who immediately recognized the nature of the threat. Historical records indicate that the Emperor had encountered similar entities during the unification wars on Terra, specifically a xenos infiltration of the Indonesic bloc that had used comparable parasitic organisms. While those earlier xenos had been a splinter group, or perhaps an advanced scout for the Rangdan, the Emperor understood the existential danger they represented to his nascent Imperium. His response was swift and decisive. The Emperor dispatched his First Legion, the Dark Angels, under the command of their Primarch Lion Eljonson, to contain the Rangdan expansion. The Dark Angels at this time represented the Emperor's most powerful military asset, a legion nearly 200,000 strong, equipped with weapons and technologies not entrusted to other legions. The Lion's instructions were explicit and severe. The Rangdan contamination was to be contained at all costs, with no consideration for civilian casualties or collateral damage. Worlds suspected of Rangdan infiltration were to be subjected to exterminatus rather than risk further spread of the cerebral parasites. This marked one of the first implementations of exterminatus as a strategic policy rather than a last resort. Accompanying the Dark Angels were specialized Mechanicum detachments, equipped with technology specifically designed to detect and neutralize Rangdan biological agents. These included rad beamers calibrated to destroy parasitic organisms without harming host bodies, stasis chambers for preserving specimens for study, and cortical scramblers that could disrupt the neural interfaces between parasites and their hosts. Most ominously, historical fragments suggest the Emperor provided the Lion with access to weapons from the Dark Age of technology that had been sealed in the vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, weapons of such terrible potency that their use had been prohibited even during the most desperate hours of the Unification Wars. These weapons would later be deployed during the darkest moments of the First Xenocide, when conventional military assets proved insufficient against the Rangdan threat. As the Dark Angels prepared their counter-offensive, the full scale of the Rangdan contamination became apparent. Astropathic communications from the northeastern fringe grew increasingly distorted, with many astropaths reporting shadows moving behind their thoughts when attempting to contact worlds in the affected region. Several navigator houses refused outright to plot courses to systems near the expansion front, claiming to see crawling darkness in the warp currents surrounding those areas. By the time the Dark Angels fleet reached the edge of the contamination zone in early 827, over 50 human worlds had fallen to the Rangdan. The frontier of Imperial expansion in the galactic northeast had effectively collapsed, creating a wound in the Emperor's Great Crusade that threatened to fester and spread throughout the nascent Imperium. The first Rangdan Xenocide had begun in earnest, and it would demand a terrible price from humanity's defenders. The arrival of Lion El'Jonson and his Dark Angels at the northeastern frontier marked a pivotal shift in the Imperium's response to the Rangdan threat. Unlike other Legion deployments during the Great Crusade, which typically emphasized compliance and integration of human worlds, the Lion approached the Xenocides with cold, methodical extermination as his sole objective. Johnson's tactical philosophy for the Rangdan campaigns was documented in fragmentary strategic briefings recovered from the Dark Angel's battle barge Invincible Reason. These documents reveal a commander who recognized conventional warfare would prove inadequate against an enemy that weaponized infiltration and subversion. The Lion developed a three-tiered strategic approach that would define Dark Angel's operations throughout the Xenocides. The first tier involved establishing quarantine zones through what the Lion termed firebreak worlds, essentially sacrificing frontier planets by subjecting them to controlled exterminatus to create buffer zones between Rangdan-controlled space and uncontaminated Imperial territory. This approach proved controversial even within the normally stoic First Legion, as it condemned billions of potentially uninfected humans to death. The Lion justified these actions with clinical precision, demonstrating through mathematical models that each firebreak world potentially saved dozens of core systems from contamination. The second tier consisted of specialized strike forces designed to target Rangdan command nodes. The Lion had determined through early engagements that Rangdan forces operated with a distributed but hierarchical control structure. By analyzing movement patterns and communication frequencies, Dark Angel's intelligence units identified systems that appeared to function as coordination centers. These became priority targets for the Legion's elite formations. The third and most resource-intensive tier involved direct military confrontation with primary Rangdan forces. For these engagements, the Lion deployed the full might of the First Legion in carefully orchestrated campaigns designed to draw out and destroy the most powerful Rangdan assets. To implement this strategy, Lion El'Jonson reorganized the Dark Angels into specialized formations, many of which were created specifically to counter Rangdan capabilities. The most prominent of these formations was the Dreadwing, a cadre of warriors equipped with esoteric weaponry designed to combat enemies that conventional arms could not effectively engage. While the Dreadwing had existed as one of the Dark Angel's 6 wings before the Rangdan conflict, it gained particular prominence during this period, growing from a specialist detachment to a major combat formation. Dreadwing warriors carried weapons normally forbidden by Imperial edict, phosphex bombs that released self-propagating fire which could burn even in vacuum, rad weapons that saturated areas with deadly radiation while leaving infrastructure intact, and vortex detonators that could tear holes in reality itself. They marched to war in specialized Dreadwing prototype Terminator armor, hermetically sealed and equipped with advanced filtration systems designed to resist Rangdan biological agents. The effectiveness of the Dreadwing against Rangdan forces was documented in after-action reports from the Battle of Piraeus IV, where 300 Dreadwing Terminators engaged a Rangdan processing node that had already consumed a population of 12 million. The Terminators deployed in a 3-pronged assault, using phosphex weapons to create advancing walls of unquenchable fire that herded Rangdan organisms toward prepared killing grounds. There, rad cannons bombarded the concentrated enemy forces with lethal radiation that broke down the molecular bonds of their biological technology. Survivors were systematically eliminated with Volkite weapons that reduced them to ash, preventing any possibility of biological material being recovered or dispersed. Complementing the Dreadwing was the Firewing, a formation shrouded in even greater secrecy. Unlike other Dark Angel's wings that operated openly, the Firewing functioned as a covert intelligence and assassination unit. Firewing operatives specialized in infiltrating Rangdan-controlled worlds to gather intelligence and eliminate key targets before larger Legion forces arrived. They utilized rare phase shifting technology that allowed them to move through solid matter for brief periods, enabling them to bypass Rangdan security measures. The most elite Dark Angels formation deployed against the Rangdan was the Hexagrammaton, 6 specialized companies personally commanded by the Lion, each mastering a different aspect of warfare. The Deathwing, later famous as the Legion's Terminator Elite, originally specialized in rapid deployment and decapitation strikes against Rangdan leadership structures. The Raven Wing, with their jet bikes and land speeders, conducted high-speed reconnaissance and disruption operations, mapping Rangdan movements and preventing their forces from consolidating. Perhaps most controversial was the deployment of the Crave Hunters, a formation not officially acknowledged in any Legion records, but referenced in encrypted communications between the Lion and the Emperor. These specialized units were created specifically to counter the psychic abilities of the Slogth murder minds that controlled Rangdan forces. Crave Hunters underwent modifications that rendered them resistant to mental domination, though at the cost of emotional detachment, so severe that many were considered unsuitable for normal Legion operations after the Xenocides concluded. The Dark Angels' arsenal during the Rangdan campaigns included weapon systems not seen before or since in Imperial records. The Mechanicum provided the Legion with experimental graviton weaponry capable of manipulating local gravity fields, technology particularly effective against the Rangdan, whose semi-fluid biology was vulnerable to extreme gravitational stress. These weapons could compress Rangdan organisms to the point of cellular collapse, or conversely, reduce gravitational forces to trap them in low-gravity fields where they could be systematically eliminated. More sinister were the esoteric weapons drawn from the Emperor's personal vaults on Terra. Among these was the Tuchulcha engine, a device of unknown origin that could manipulate space-time to create localized reality distortions. The Lion deployed this weapon during the Battle of Advex Moors, using it to trap a Rangdan fleet in a pocket of dilated time, where seconds for the Xenos vessels translated to hours for the attacking Dark Angels. The trapped Rangdan ships were methodically dismantled by concentrated fire, unable to maneuver or return fire effectively due to their temporal disadvantage. The Dark Angels also deployed what fragmentary records refer to as the Exindio, artificial intelligence constructs from the Dark Age of technology, specifically engineered for combat against other sentient machines. These forbidden weapons were unleashed against Rangdan systems suspected of utilizing similar AI technology, with Mechanicum adepts standing by to deactivate the Exindio once their objectives were complete. The use of such technology represented an extreme measure, as AI had been outlawed since the horrors of the Men of Iron rebellions during the Age of Strife. Most devastating in the Dark Angels' arsenal were the Phosphex weapons, incendiary devices that released a self-sustaining compound that continued to burn until it consumed all available matter. Unlike conventional incendiaries, Phosphex could burn underwater or in vacuum, and proved particularly effective against the regenerative biological technology of the Rangdan. Dark Angels' assault formations would deploy Phosphex bombs to create advancing walls of pale green fire, channeling Rangdan forces into prepared killing zones, or simply burning entire regions to sterile ash. The psychological impact of these campaigns on the Dark Angels cannot be overstated. Fragmentary medical logs from Legion apothecaries document increasing cases of combat stress and psychological trauma among Astartes, remarkable given their enhanced resilience to such conditions. Warriors who had fought without hesitation against countless other xenos species began showing signs of psychological strain when deployed repeatedly against the Rangdan. This psychological toll stemmed not only from the nature of the enemy, but from the methods required to combat them. Dark Angels were forced to exterminate human populations that showed signs of Rangdan infiltration, including children and civilians who might appear outwardly unaffected but carried dormant parasites. The systematic destruction of human worlds as part of the firebreak strategy weighed heavily on many within the Legion, particularly those who had been recruited from the forests of Caliban with notions of knightly honor. Most disturbing were the effects on Astartes who had direct mental contact with Rangdan entities. Despite their enhanced mental conditioning, Space Marines who encountered the psychic abilities of Slogth murder minds often exhibited lasting behavioral changes. Some became pathologically secretive, unwilling to share tactical information even with battle brothers. Others developed obsessive behaviors, particularly regarding biological contamination, insisting on excessive decontamination protocols, even in clearly secure environments. The Lion's response to these psychological issues was characteristically pragmatic. Rather than addressing the underlying trauma, he institutionalized compartmentalization of information and operations within the Legion. Units that showed signs of psychological compromise were isolated and assigned to specialized duties away from the main force. Warriors who had been exposed to Rangdan psychic influence were subjected to memory blocks by Legion librarians, their experiences sealed away but not truly healed. This approach proved tactically effective, but created lasting cultural patterns within the Dark Angels. The habit of containing problematic knowledge, rather than addressing it, directly became ingrained in Legion procedures. Units operated on a strict need-to-know basis, with each level of the command structure holding information unavailable to those below. This organizational culture of secrecy, initially developed as a protective measure against Rangdan infiltration, would later evolve into the chapter's notorious reticence and compartmentalized structure. The Rangdan campaigns also established the precedent for what would later become known as the Inner Circle of the Dark Angels. During the height of the conflict, the Lion created a cadre of trusted officers who were privy to the full scope of the Rangdan threat and the forbidden weapons deployed against it. These officers were sworn to secrecy through binding oaths and psychic conditioning, creating an inner leadership group separate from the regular command structure. After the Xenocides concluded, this group was maintained to safeguard the knowledge of what had been done and what weapons remained in the Legion's hidden arsenals. The true horror of the Rangdan lay not merely in their numbers or military strength, but in the alien nature of their technology and warfare methodology. What little information survived Imperial purges reveals an adversary whose technological capabilities represented a paradigm fundamentally different from both human and known xenos approaches to war. Rangdan technology defied conventional Imperial classification systems. Magos biologists who examined captured Rangdan artifacts described them as techno-organic constructs that blur the distinction between machine, organism, and weapon. Unlike Tyrannid bioweapons encountered millennia later, which were purely biological in nature, Rangdan technology integrated synthetic components with living tissue in ways that suggested a complete mastery of both domains. The most common Rangdan weapons encountered by Imperial forces were designated synaptic disruptors in classified Mechanicum reports. These weapons fired not solid projectiles or energy beams, but microscopic organisms suspended in a carrier medium that could penetrate sealed armor through molecular scale imperfections. Once inside a target's armor, these organisms would rapidly multiply and attack the nervous system, causing excruciating pain followed by paralysis and eventually death as vital functions ceased. What made these weapons particularly insidious was their ability to transmit the neural activity of dying victims back to Rangdan command structures, essentially harvesting tactical information even as they killed. More terrifying were the conversion matrices deployed against civilian populations. These devices resembled metallic obelisks approximately 3 meters in height, covered in shifting patterns of light that seemed to move with purpose. When activated, a conversion matrix would emit fields that affected organic matter at the cellular level within a radius of several kilometers. Humans caught in these fields underwent gradual but irreversible physiological changes, their bodies and minds slowly reconfiguring to serve Rangdan purposes. The process was not instantaneous, often taking weeks to complete, with victims remaining conscious and aware throughout their transformation, a psychological weapon as much as a biological one. Rangdan Voidcraft demonstrated equally advanced technology. Their ships possessed hulls composed of a material that behaved like a non-Newtonian fluid, hardening instantly in response to weapons impacts, while remaining flexible enough to absorb and distribute kinetic energy. This allowed even relatively small Rangdan vessels to withstand firepower that would cripple Imperial ships of equivalent size. More disturbing was their apparent ability to partially phase out of real space, becoming semi-corporeal, and thus able to pass through solid matter under certain conditions. Imperial captains reported Rangdan boarding parties emerging directly through intact hull sections without any evidence of breach points. The propulsion systems of Rangdan vessels defied conventional understanding. They emitted no detectable exhaust and generated no recognizable energy signatures, yet could accelerate at rates that would have crushed organic pilots. Mechanicum analysis of movement patterns suggested the ships might be manipulating local space-time geometry rather than generating thrust in the conventional sense, effectively sliding between points in space by altering the distance between them rather than traversing it. Communication between Rangdan forces occurred through means undetectable by Imperial technology. No Vox transmissions or similar electromagnetic signals were ever intercepted between their vessels or ground forces, suggesting either perfect communications discipline or, more likely, an entirely different method of information exchange. Some librarians who encountered Rangdan forces reported sensing shadows moving between mines in their vicinity, leading to theories that the Rangdan might utilize some form of technologically augmented telepathy for battlefield coordination. Perhaps most alarming was the Rangdan approach to computational systems. Unlike the logic engines of the Mechanicum or the crude but effective cogitators of Imperial vessels, Rangdan computing appeared to be distributed throughout their biological components. Each individual organism, whether a warrior, weapon, or vessel, contained computational capacity, creating a vast parallel processing network that could adapt and respond to battlefield conditions with frightening speed. This distributed intelligence made Rangdan forces remarkably resilient to decapitation strikes. Removing command nodes merely degraded their efficiency rather than crippling their operations. The connection between the Rangdan and the entities known as the Slogth represents one of the most heavily censored aspects of the entire conflict. Fragmentary references in Ordo Xenos archives suggest the Slogth were not merely allies of the Rangdan, but potentially their creators or masters. The Slogth themselves were ancient xenos described in the few surviving accounts as worm-like congregations of sentient maggots that could assume humanoid form. Their technology centered around consumption and transformation. They were known to devour both the bodies and minds of their victims, absorbing memories and knowledge directly. The Slogth had been encountered by humanity before the Rangdan Xenocides, primarily through their infiltration of human societies at the fringes of the galaxy. They were known to use human agents, either controlled through parasitic infection or subverted through more subtle means, to extend their influence. This methodology aligned perfectly with Rangdan infiltration tactics, suggesting a shared strategic approach, if not a direct connection. Most compelling evidence for the Slogth-Rangdan connection comes from a heavily redacted report by interrogator Melpomene of the Ordo Xenos, who conducted examination of a captured Rangdan command entity in the aftermath of the Battle of Advex Moors. The report describes finding characteristic Slogth cellular structures within the entity's brain stem, arranged in patterns consistent with neuroparasitic control mechanisms previously documented in human thralls of confirmed Slogth origin. The report concludes with the assessment that the examined Rangdan represented not a distinct species, but rather a purpose-bred biological construct designed by Slogth bioengineers as a self-replicating expansion system. If this assessment is accurate, it suggests the Rangdan may have been a specially engineered weapon system deployed by the Slogth, a means to soften Imperial resistance before a planned larger Slogth invasion. This would explain the focus on subversion and transformation rather than simple destruction. The Rangdan were preparing human populations and infrastructure for eventual Slogth consumption and occupation. The biological warfare capabilities of the Rangdan represented their most distinctive and terrifying aspect. Unlike conventional biological weapons that simply killed their targets, Rangdan bioweapons were designed to transform and repurpose. Their primary delivery system was the cerebral parasite, a microscopic organism that could enter a host through any orifice, or in more advanced variants, directly through the skin. Once inside a host, these parasites would migrate to the central nervous system, where they established a secondary neural network that gradually assumed control of the victim's body. The insidious nature of these parasites lay in their subtlety. Infected individuals showed no immediate symptoms and retained all memories and personality traits, making detection extremely difficult in the early stages. Over time, usually weeks or months depending on the variant, the parasite would establish sufficient neural connections to influence and eventually control the host's behavior. This process was so gradual that victims often remained unaware of their compromised state until the later stages, when they might experience brief moments of clarity as the parasite's control momentarily slipped. Most disturbing was the parasite's ability to transmit information between hosts, creating a networked intelligence across infected populations. Infected individuals separated by considerable distances could coordinate actions without visible communication, sharing sensory information and tactical assessments through the parasitic network. This allowed Rangdan infiltration of Imperial command structures to operate with unprecedented coordination, with infected personnel across different departments and locations working in concert toward Rangdan objectives. The transformation of conquered populations followed a systematic pattern documented by Imperial xenobiologists who studied reclaimed worlds. The process began with the introduction of cerebral parasites into water supplies or air circulation systems, ensuring widespread initial infection. Once a critical percentage of the population was infected, usually estimated at 30–40%, the parasites would trigger behavioral changes that facilitated the next phase, the construction of conversion matrices. Infected individuals would begin gathering materials and constructing the obelisk-like devices in key population centers, often repurposing existing infrastructure and technology. Once operational, these matrices accelerated and expanded the transformation process, affecting even uninfected individuals within their range. The matrices emitted fields that rewrote genetic material at the cellular level, gradually reshaping human physiology to better serve Rangdan purposes. The end result was a stratified population of transformed humans with specialized physiological adaptations. Some became processing units, their enhanced brains linked directly to Rangdan computational networks. Others transformed into maintenance organisms, their limbs elongated and modified with tool-like appendages for constructing and repairing Rangdan technology. The most drastically altered became combat organisms, their bodies enlarged and reinforced with chitinous armor, internal organs repurposed to produce toxins or energetic compounds for weapon systems. Throughout this process, the victims retained their original consciousness and memories, trapped within bodies they no longer controlled. This psychological torture served a practical purpose beyond mere cruelty. The Rangdan could access the knowledge and skills of the original personality when needed, essentially preserving useful information while ensuring compliance through complete physiological control. The technological sophistication of the Rangdan posed unprecedented challenges for Imperial forces. Their weapons and defenses operated on principles that often seemed to contradict established understanding of physics and biology. Mechanicum analysis of recovered Rangdan technology revealed several key innovations that placed them far beyond contemporary Imperial capabilities in certain domains. Their materials science was particularly advanced, centered around programmable matter that could change properties in response to specific stimuli. Rangdan armor could harden instantly when struck by kinetic weapons, then flow like liquid to seal breaches or redistribute to reinforce threatened areas. Similarly, their structural materials could alter thermal conductivity, electrical resistance, or optical properties as needed, making their installations highly adaptable to changing battlefield conditions. Rangdan energy weapons operated on principles that baffled Imperial technologists. Rather than projecting energy in conventional beams or bursts, they created localized distortions in fundamental forces, weakening molecular bonds, altering electromagnetic interactions, or even briefly changing the local gravitational constant. These effects were typically short-lived but devastating, causing materials to disintegrate, power systems to overload, or biological tissues to lose cohesion. Perhaps most concerning was evidence that Rangdan technology could directly interface with and subvert machine spirits. Imperial vehicles and systems in proximity to certain Rangdan devices experienced unexpected malfunctions, with machine spirits exhibiting behaviors inconsistent with their programming. In several documented cases, Imperial war machines turned on their own forces after exposure to Rangdan influence, suggesting some means of corrupting or overriding their core directives. This technological interface capability extended to biological systems as well. Rangdan devices could apparently communicate directly with their cerebral parasites, updating their programming or triggering specific responses in infected hosts. This created a seamless integration between their technological and biological warfare systems, with each amplifying the effectiveness of the other. The Rangdan approach to warfare demonstrated a fundamental philosophical difference from Imperial doctrine. Where the Imperium emphasized overwhelming force and strategic dominance, the Rangdan prioritized efficiency and minimal resource expenditure. They would deploy precisely calibrated forces to achieve specific objectives, never committing more resources than necessary for a given task. This surgical approach made their movements difficult to predict, as they often bypassed seemingly valuable targets in favor of less obvious objectives that served their larger strategic goals. Their battlefield tactics emphasized disruption over direct confrontation. Rangdan forces would target communication systems, logistics networks, and command structures rather than engaging enemy combat units directly. When forced into direct combat, they employed swarming tactics with multiple smaller units coordinating perfectly to overwhelm isolated enemy formations. This coordination extended across different types of forces, aerial, ground, and even subsurface units would operate in concert, attacking from multiple vectors simultaneously. The most effective Imperial countermeasures against Rangdan technology came from unlikely sources. The Dark Angels discovered that certain ancient weapons from Old Night, particularly those designed to combat men of iron during their rebellion, proved unexpectedly effective against Rangdan systems. These weapons, which operated on principles lost to current Imperial science, could disrupt the complex integrated networks that Rangdan technology relied upon. Similarly, certain psychic techniques developed by the Librarius proved capable of detecting and disrupting the neural patterns of cerebral parasites. By projecting specific psychic frequencies, trained librarians could cause the parasites to reveal their presence, making infected individuals identifiable. In extreme cases, particularly powerful psychers could directly attack the parasites through their connection to the host's nervous system, though this process was dangerous for both the psyker and the infected individual. The Mechanicum contributed to the war effort by developing specialized cogitator systems, isolated from standard machine spirits and hardened against Rangdan subversion. These systems, operating on simplified but secure principles, provided limited but reliable computational support for Imperial forces. More importantly, they developed detection protocols that could identify subtle signs of Rangdan technological influence, allowing early warning of infiltration attempts. Despite these countermeasures, the technological gap between Imperial forces and the Rangdan remained significant throughout the conflict. Victory ultimately came not through technological superiority, but through the application of overwhelming force, willingness to accept extreme casualties, and the deployment of weapons so destructive that even the adaptable Rangdan could not withstand them. The Dark Angels and their supporting forces essentially burned away the infection, accepting the loss of countless worlds as the necessary price for eliminating the Rangdan threat. The Rangdan threat required a response beyond even the considerable might of the Dark Angels Legion. As the scale of the Xenos expansion became clear, the Emperor authorized the deployment of multiple Space Marine legions in what would become one of the largest coordinated Astartes operations of the Great Crusade. Imperial war councils, held aboard the battle barge Invincible Reason, established a multi-layered strategic approach that would draw upon the specialized capabilities of several legions. The Death Guard, under the stern leadership of Mortarion, arrived at the northeastern frontier in the year 830 of the 30th millennium. Their deployment marked a significant shift in Imperial strategy against the Rangdan. While the Dark Angels had focused on containment and targeted strikes, the Death Guard specialized in biological warfare countermeasures and scorched earth operations, capabilities perfectly suited to combating the Rangdan's insidious infiltration methods. Mortarion's legion brought with them specialized equipment developed in conjunction with Mechanicum Biologica's adepts. Their armor incorporated enhanced filtration systems capable of detecting and neutralizing Rangdan biological agents down to the molecular level. Death Guard apothecaries carried modified narthecium units that could identify cerebral parasite infection in its earliest stages, allowing for targeted elimination of compromised individuals before the parasites established full neural control. The Death Guard established what they termed purification zones around worlds suspected of Rangdan contamination. These operations followed a methodical pattern that became the standard protocol for reclaiming infected territories. First, specialized destroyer squads would deploy wide-spectrum toxins designed to eliminate all biological matter, including Rangdan organisms. These compounds, many developed specifically for the Xenocide campaigns, could penetrate even the adaptive biological defenses of Rangdan technology. Following the initial chemical purge, Death Guard heavy units would advance through the contaminated areas, using flamers and phosphex weapons to ensure complete sterilization. Unlike other legions that might balk at such wholesale destruction, the Death Guard approached these operations with grim determination, viewing the eradication of all life on infected worlds as a necessary sacrifice to prevent further spread of the Rangdan taint. A particularly notable Death Guard operation occurred on the mining world of Steno 4, where preliminary scans had detected unusual biological signatures consistent with early-stage Rangdan infiltration. Rather than attempt to separate infected from uninfected populations, Mortarion ordered the deployment of Life Eater virus across the entire main habitation zone, an area containing approximately 12 million Imperial citizens. The virus reduced all organic matter to a nutrient-rich slurry within hours, eliminating the Rangdan presence, but also every human, animal, and plant in the region. When questioned about the extreme nature of this action by Imperial army commanders, Mortarion reportedly responded, "The Emperor's mercy is not measured in individual lives preserved, but in humanity's continued existence. One world is nothing compared to what will be lost should the Rangdan spread further." This uncompromising approach proved effective against the Rangdan's infiltration tactics. The Death Guard created buffer zones where no biological material remained for the Rangdan to subvert or consume, essentially starving the xenos of the resources they needed to expand. These sterile regions became known as Mortarion's firebreaks, dead zones that separated purified Imperial territory from Rangdan-controlled space. The Death Guard also developed specialized units for recovering and containing Rangdan biological samples. These corpus retrieval teams operated in modified Terminator armor equipped with stasis field generators that could preserve Rangdan specimens in temporal suspension, preventing them from adapting or self-destructing when captured. These samples proved invaluable to Imperial research efforts, allowing Mechanicum Biologica's experts to develop increasingly effective countermeasures against Rangdan parasites and bioweapons. While the Death Guard established containment perimeters, fragmentary records indicate the Space Wolves Legion was deployed for more direct assault operations against Rangdan strongholds. The Sons of Rus operated under a veil of secrecy, unusual even by the standards of the Rangdan campaigns, with most documentation of their involvement either destroyed or sealed in the most restricted archives on Terra. What little information survived Imperial censorship suggests the Space Wolves were employed as the Emperor's executioners in the most literal sense. They were tasked with striking directly at identified Rangdan command nodes, the central hubs where the Sloggth murder minds coordinated their forces. These operations required penetrating deep into Rangdan-controlled space, bypassing contaminated worlds and defense systems to reach high-value targets. The Space Wolves' involvement is most clearly documented in the assault on the Rangdan coordination node designated Cerebrum Omega, a massive space station orbiting a dying star in the Ghoul Stars region. Historical fragments describe a force of 3,000 Space Wolves warriors led by Leman Russ himself, launching a surprise attack using a captured Rangdan vessel as cover. The battle lasted 27 hours, with the Space Wolves fighting through progressively more heavily defended chambers toward the station's central control nexus. What they found there remains classified at the highest level, with only cryptic references to the thinking darkness and worms that wear the faces of men, surviving in personal journals of Space Wolves veterans. Whatever horrors they encountered, the Space Wolves succeeded in destroying the station, dealing a significant blow to Rangdan command and control capabilities in that sector. The nature of Space Wolves' operations against the Rangdan appears to have been particularly brutal, even by the standards of the Xenocides. Surviving accounts mention the use of specialized execution squads who were tasked with eliminating not only Rangdan organisms, but also any Imperial citizens who had been exposed to their influence. These cleanser packs operated with a level of autonomy unusual for Astartes forces, given broad sanction to determine contamination and implement purges without oversight from regular command structures. This operational freedom led to incidents that troubled even hardened Imperial commanders. On at least 3 occasions, Space Wolves forces declared entire Imperial army regiments compromised and eliminated them despite protests from their commanding officers. In each case, subsequent investigation revealed at least some level of Rangdan infiltration, but the wholesale slaughter of thousands of soldiers to eliminate a relatively small number of infected individuals raised questions about proportionality and control. Leman Russ reportedly defended these actions directly to the Emperor, arguing that half measures against this enemy mean total defeat. Historical records suggest the Emperor accepted this assessment, granting the Space Wolves continued operational freedom despite concerns from other Imperial authorities. The most secretive aspect of the Legion's Astartes deployment against the Rangdan involved specialized units and weapons systems that existed outside normal Legion structures. Chief among these were the Black Shield forces, Astartes who operated without Legion markings or identification, often equipped with experimental weapons and technology deemed too dangerous or morally questionable for standard deployment. These Black Shield units typically comprised warriors drawn from multiple legions, selected for specific psychological and physical traits that made them suitable for the most demanding operations. They operated under direct authority from the Emperor or Malcador, the Sigillite, bypassing normal Legion command structures. Their missions focused on testing experimental weapons against Rangdan forces and conducting operations too extreme to be associated with any recognized Imperial organization. Among the specialized weapons deployed by these units were devices recovered from Dark Age vaults that manipulated fundamental forces in ways beyond contemporary Imperial science. The Vortex Phase Displacer could temporarily shift targets partially out of phase with normal space-time, causing horrific damage as molecular structures tried to occupy the same space simultaneously when phase coherence was restored. The Grav Implosion cannon created localized gravitational singularities that crushed targets to quantum scales before dissipating in bursts of Hawking radiation. Most controversial were the psychic nullification arrays, devices that generated fields capable of severing the connection between cerebral parasites and their controlling intelligence. These weapons caused excruciating pain to any psychers in their area of effect, but proved highly effective against the psychically linked Rangdan command structures. The use of such weapons represented a significant moral compromise, as they caused permanent neurological damage to any human psychers caught in their field, effectively burning out their psychic abilities along with any Rangdan neural connections. The Ordo Chronos, a now defunct branch of the Inquisition that investigated temporal anomalies, maintained sealed records suggesting even more extreme measures were employed during the final phases of the Xenocides. These fragmentary documents reference the deployment of chrono weapons, capable of accelerating or reversing entropy within targeted areas. Such technology, if it indeed existed, would have violated the Emperor's own edicts against manipulating the flow of time, suggesting the level of desperation reached in the later stages of the conflict. The coordination of these diverse Legion forces fell to Malcador the Sigillite, who established a specialized command structure known as the Rangdan Operational Strategic Command. This organization, staffed by representatives from all involved legions as well as Mechanicum and Imperial Army personnel, coordinated the overall strategic approach while allowing individual Legion forces to maintain tactical autonomy within their assigned spheres. ROSC implemented a classification system for Rangdan contaminated worlds that determined the appropriate response level. Category Alpha worlds showed no signs of contamination and were to be defended at all costs. Category Beta worlds had limited contamination confined to specific regions and were candidates for targeted cleansing operations. Category Gamma worlds had widespread contamination but retained valuable infrastructure or resources, warranting major purification efforts. Category Omega worlds were deemed irrecoverable, scheduled for complete sterilization through exterminatus or similar measures. This systematic approach allowed Imperial forces to prioritize their efforts, concentrating on worlds that could be saved while efficiently eliminating those that posed the greatest contamination risk. The classification system also helped resolve conflicts between Legion commanders with different strategic priorities, providing a common framework for decision-making. The combined Legion operations against the Rangdan reached their peak during the assault on the Rangdan primary Bioforge world designated Arafel. This massive campaign involved elements from at least 4 legions operating in concert, supported by Titan legions and specialized Mechanicum assets. The Dark Angels provided the main assault force, with Death Guard units securing their flanks against biological counterattacks. Space Wolves strike teams targeted command nodes, while suspected Alpha Legion infiltration units disrupted Rangdan communication and coordination systems. The battle for Arafel lasted 76 days and resulted in the complete destruction of the planet's biosphere. Imperial forces deployed cyclonic torpedoes against key Rangdan structures, while Death Guard units systematically contaminated the atmosphere with tailored toxins that broke down the molecular structure of Rangdan biological technology. By the campaign's end, Arafel had been reduced to a barren rock, its surface scoured clean of all life forms, and its elaborate underground facilities collapsed through targeted tectonic weapons. The victory at Arafel marked a turning point in the Xenocides, demonstrating that coordinated Legion operations could overcome even the most heavily defended Rangdan strongholds. More importantly, the destruction of the Bioforge eliminated one of the primary sources of Rangdan war materiel, significantly reducing their ability to replace losses and expand their forces. As the Rangdan were gradually pushed back toward the galactic fringe, the Emperor authorized increasingly extreme measures to ensure their complete eradication. Among these was the deployment of the Terminus Decree, a contingency that had been prepared but never before implemented during the Great Crusade. The exact nature of this measure remains unknown, as all records were purged following the conclusion of the Xenocides, but surviving references suggest it involved weapons of such destructive potential that their use was considered an absolute last resort. The second major Rangdan offensive began in earnest during the latter months of the 862nd year of the 30th millennium, catching Imperial forces in a moment of strategic realignment. The Dark Angels Legion had been rotating battle-weary companies back to their fortress monastery on Caliban, while the Death Guard were redeploying to address a significant orc presence in the Cave's belt. This temporary reduction in Astartes' strength along the northeastern containment zone provided the opening the Rangdan had been waiting for. The first indication of renewed Rangdan activity came when astropathic communications from the frontier world of Thranx IV abruptly ceased. Imperial Navy picket ships dispatched to investigate found the planet's orbital defense platforms drifting silently, their crews missing and all systems powered down. When boarding parties accessed the command decks, they discovered the platform's machine spirits had been completely erased, not damaged or corrupted, but methodically removed, leaving behind perfectly functional hardware devoid of any operational logic. Within 16 days, 7 additional systems went dark in a cascading pattern that suggested a coordinated multi-vector assault. Mechanicum analysts identified a troubling evolution in Rangdan methodology, rather than the gradual infiltration and subversion tactics observed during the first Xenocide. These attacks displayed a brutal efficiency focused on rapid neutralization of Imperial defense capabilities. The Forge world of Zana II, which had been producing specialized anti-Rangdan weaponry, came under attack by previously unencountered Rangdan vessel configurations. Survivors described ships with biological components that appeared to be in constant distress, their hulls rippling with what seemed to be peristaltic contractions. These vessels emitted no energy signatures detectable by Imperial auger arrays until they opened fire, using weapons that generated localized reality distortions rather than conventional energy or projectile attacks. The Zana II orbital shipyards were destroyed in under 6 hours, with 19 vessels under construction lost along with approximately 85,000 Mechanicum personnel. More concerning than the material losses was the evidence that the Rangdan had specifically targeted facilities producing anti-parasitic field generators and specialized detection equipment designed to identify cerebral parasite infiltration. This targeting precision suggested the Rangdan had detailed intelligence about Imperial countermeasures, information they could only have obtained through extensive infiltration of command structures or data repositories. As the Rangdan offensive expanded, Imperial forces found themselves facing an enemy that had adapted to their tactics and countermeasures. The biological weapons deployed by the Death Guard during the first Xenocide proved ineffective against new Rangdan morphotypes that displayed immunity to previously lethal toxins. Similarly, the radiation-based sterilization protocols established for cleansing contaminated zones no longer achieved the expected elimination rates, with Rangdan organisms showing enhanced resistance to even the most intense radiation fields. The 18th Expeditionary Fleet, comprising 3 capital ships, 14 escorts, and approximately 85,000 Imperial Army troops, encountered a Rangdan force in the Shedim Drift. The engagement lasted less than 4 hours and resulted in the complete destruction of the Imperial fleet. A single astropathic transmission, fragmented and corrupted, reached nearby Imperial forces before communications were lost. The message contained sensor data showing Rangdan vessels employing some form of phase technology that allowed them to briefly shift partly out of real space, causing Imperial weapons fire to pass harmlessly through their hulls. This phase technology represented a significant escalation in Rangdan capabilities. Previous encounters had shown them to be formidable but ultimately vulnerable to overwhelming firepower. The ability to phase partially out of reality negated this vulnerability, forcing Imperial commanders to develop entirely new engagement protocols. Mechanicum weapons specialists theorized that the Rangdan had adapted this technology from studying Imperial phase weapons captured during earlier conflicts, a disturbing example of their ability to assimilate and improve upon enemy technology. By mid-863, the Rangdan offensive had expanded to encompass 32 star systems, including several that had been cleansed and fortified following the first Xenocide. The speed of their advance created strategic confusion among Imperial command structures, with forces repeatedly deployed to defend systems, only to find them already fallen by the time they arrived. This forced a fundamental reassessment of Imperial strategy, shifting from a defensive containment approach to the establishment of fallback positions and counter-attack staging grounds. The human cost of these losses was staggering. Conservative estimates place the number of Imperial citizens lost to Rangdan forces during this phase at approximately 11 billion, with countless more subjected to the horror of Rangdan conversion processes. Particularly devastating was the fall of the hive world Lorelei, whose population of 8 billion had been a crucial source of recruitment for Imperial army regiments. Fragmentary Vox transmissions from the planet's final hours described walking towers of flesh moving through the hive spires, harvesting civilians with mechanical appendages that sorted them according to some unknowable criteria. For the Astartes legions, the second Xenocide exacted a terrible toll. The Dark Angels, still the primary legion engaged against the Rangdan, suffered catastrophic casualties during the defense of the Auriok sector. 3 full companies, comprising approximately 300 Astartes, were lost during the Battle of Madrigal Sphere when their strike cruiser Sword of Caliban was surrounded by Rangdan vessels employing the new phase technology. Rather than allow themselves to be captured, the commanding officer, Master Zahariel, ordered the detonation of the ship's warp drive, destroying not only his own vessel, but also 3 Rangdan ships caught in the resulting Imperium breach. The heaviest losses came during the 3-month campaign to defend the Forge world Atrax Primaris, a crucial supply hub for Imperial forces in the sector. Lion Eljonson personally led a force of 5,000 Dark Angels against a Rangdan invasion fleet, hoping to prevent the fall of a world whose manufacturing capabilities were essential to the ongoing war effort. The ensuing conflict saw some of the most intense fighting of the entire Xenocide campaign, with Dark Angels forces engaged in simultaneous void combat, orbital defense, and ground operations. The battle reached its climax when Rangdan forces deployed a new weapon designated by Imperial forces as a reality cancer, a device that caused localized degradation of the barrier between real space and the warp. The affected areas experienced unpredictable physical laws and spatial distortions, making conventional combat nearly impossible. Dark Angels librarians attempted to stabilize these regions, but found their psychic abilities reflected back upon them, causing several to suffer catastrophic mental collapse. When it became clear that Atrax Primaris could not be held, Lion Eljonson ordered a fighting withdrawal, with rearguard units sacrificing themselves to allow the evacuation of as many Mechanicum personnel and critical manufacturing equipment as possible. Of the 5,000 Dark Angels who began the campaign, only 3,412 survived to reach Imperial lines. Among the fallen were 3 company masters and the chief librarian Zahariel, whose death dealing with a Rangdan psyker form was described in surviving accounts as a conflagration of mental energies that momentarily outshone the system's sun. The loss of Atrax Primaris represented more than just another fallen world. It created a critical gap in the Imperial supply chain that would hamper operations for years to come. The specialized plasma weaponry produced in its forges had proven particularly effective against certain Rangdan morphotypes, and no other facility in the sector could match its production capacity or technical expertise. Beyond the Dark Angels, other legions also suffered significant losses during this phase of the conflict. A Death Guard contingent of approximately 800 Astartes under Commander Ignatius Grolger was presumed lost when their fleet disappeared in the Sondheim cluster. No distress signals were received, and subsequent Imperial patrols found only debris fields containing fragments of Astartes armor and ship components, suggesting a battle of extraordinary violence. The Space Wolves, operating primarily as hunter-killer units targeting Rangdan command nodes, lost 3 packs totaling 150 warriors during an operation deep in Rangdan-controlled space. The mission details remain classified, but fragmentary records indicate they were attempting to eliminate a Rangdan entity designated Thoughtweaver Alpha, believed to be one of the controlling intelligences coordinating the offensive. While the operation's outcome is not clearly documented, the subsequent disruption of Rangdan activities in that sector suggests the Space Wolves may have succeeded despite their losses. Perhaps most concerning were reports of Imperial forces turning against their own. On at least 7 documented occasions, Imperial army units or even small groups of Astartes exhibited behavior consistent with Rangdan cerebral parasite infiltration. These instances necessitated the implementation of Protocol Terminus, the immediate elimination of all potentially compromised forces by specialized Astartes units trained to recognize and respond to signs of Rangdan influence. The most notable such incident occurred when the 89th Terran Rifles, a veteran regiment with an exemplary service record, suddenly opened fire on Dark Angel's forces during joint operations on Kedem Prime. The regiment's commanding officer, Colonel Valerius, had apparently been compromised by cerebral parasites weeks earlier and had slowly positioned his forces to maximize damage when they turned. 38 Dark Angels were killed before the situation was contained, and the entire regiment, approximately 4,000 soldiers, had to be eliminated to prevent further spread of the infection. These losses forced a strategic reassessment at the highest levels of Imperial command. The Lion, recognizing that attempting to hold the entire northeastern frontier was no longer feasible, implemented what Imperial strategists would later term defense in depth, a system of layered defensive zones with predetermined fallback positions and scorched earth protocols for worlds that could not be held. The outer layer, designated the interdiction zone, consisted of automated monitoring stations and minimal garrison forces whose primary purpose was early warning rather than active defense. Behind this, the containment zone featured heavily fortified systems with significant Astartes and Imperial army presences, designed to channel Rangdan advances into predetermined corridors where they could be engaged under favorable conditions. The final layer, the core defense zone, represented the absolute line beyond which no retreat would be permitted, protected by the full might of multiple Legion detachments and Mechanicum Titan support. This strategic realignment necessitated difficult decisions about which worlds to abandon. The agri-world Elysium, with its population of 300 million and crucial food production capabilities, fell within what would become the interdiction zone. Despite its strategic value, the Lion determined it could not be effectively defended against a determined Rangdan assault. The world's population was evacuated over a 3-month period, with approximately 85% successfully relocated to inner systems before Rangdan forces arrived. The remaining civilians and the Imperial army units covering the evacuation were lost when the planet was subjected to Exterminatus to prevent its resources from falling into Rangdan hands. Similar scenarios played out across dozens of worlds, with Imperial forces conducting what amounted to the largest organized retreat in the history of the Great Crusade. The psychological impact of these withdrawals should not be underestimated. Space Marine legions had been created to conquer, not to cede territory, and many Astartes officers found the concept of strategic withdrawal deeply troubling. Legion records from this period show an increase in disciplinary incidents and psychological trauma cases, particularly among Dark Angels units that had been forced to abandon worlds they had previously fought to defend. Despite these challenges, the implementation of the defense in depth strategy proved effective in stabilizing the Imperial position. By late 863, the rapid Rangdan advance had been slowed to a crawl, with each new incursion meeting increasingly coordinated and effective resistance. The breathing room provided by this stabilization allowed for the redeployment of additional Legion forces to the region, setting the stage for what would eventually become the counter-offensive phase of the Second Xenocide. The lessons learned during this period of strategic withdrawal would later influence Imperial military doctrine for millennia to come. The concept of defense in depth became a cornerstone of Imperial strategic thinking, particularly in regions facing existential xenos threats. Similarly, the protocols developed for identifying and responding to infiltration attempts would form the basis for later inquisitorial procedures dealing with subtle xeno-subversion. As the year 863 of the 30th millennium drew to a close, the situation had stabilized enough for Imperial forces to begin planning limited counterattacks. The Dark Angels, bolstered by fresh companies rotated in from Caliban and supported by newly arrived Death Guard contingents, began probing operations to test Rangdan defenses and identify potential weaknesses. These operations revealed that the Rangdan advance had extended their supply lines and communication networks, creating vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited in the coming campaign season. The stage was thus set for the next phase of the conflict, a grinding war of attrition that would test the resilience of the Imperium's finest warriors against an enemy that seemed capable of adapting to every strategy and weapon deployed against it. The cost had been immense, but the Imperium had weathered the initial storm of the Second Xenocide. The question now was whether it could summon the strength for a counter-offensive capable of pushing back the most serious xenos threat it had yet faced. Among the many shadows cast by the Rangdan Xenocides, perhaps none is darker or more persistent than the possible connection to the mysterious Lost Legions. The historical record of the Great Crusade era acknowledges the creation of 20 Space Marine legions, yet only 18 are named in Imperial archives. The 2nd and 11th legions and their respective Primarchs have been systematically erased from official records, their very existence reduced to occasional oblique references and conspicuous gaps in sequential numbering. The timing of the Rangdan Xenocides coincides suspiciously with the period when these two legions disappear from historical documentation. While no definitive evidence directly links their disappearance to the conflict, several fragments of information suggest a connection that the highest echelons of Imperial authority have worked diligently to obscure. The most compelling chronological evidence comes from administrative records of Legion supply requisitions preserved in Mechanicum archives on Mars. These logistical documents, concerned more with materiel allocation than strategic details, occasionally reference Legion designations by number rather than name. Supply manifests from 839 show regular requisition patterns for all 20 legions, including the 2nd and 11th. When the first Rangdan Xenocide reached its most critical phase, requisitions for the 11th Legion abruptly cease without explanation or reclassification. Similarly, Mechanicum production schedules for specialized Astartes equipment show the 2nd Legion receiving final deliveries of Dreadnought chassis and weapon systems in 865, after which their designation vanishes from all subsequent documentation. This timing aligns perfectly with the period between the 1st and 2nd Rangdan Xenocides, a time when Imperial forces were regrouping and reassessing their strategy against an enemy that had proven far more dangerous than initially anticipated. Architectural evidence from Legion facilities provides another tantalizing connection. The fortress monastery of the Dark Angels on Caliban contained a memorial hall with 20 alcoves, each designed to house a statue of a Legion Primarch. Historical accounts from remembrancers who visited the fortress before the Horus heresy describe 2 of these alcoves as empty, with visible evidence that statues had once stood there but been removed. More telling is the description of scorch marks and tool scarring around these empty spaces, suggesting the statues were not simply removed but destroyed with considerable force. What makes this architectural detail significant is that one of the empty alcoves reportedly bore a small, partially defaced inscription that included the phrase, "fell against the Rangda," before becoming illegible. This fragment, documented by remembrancer Emiliana Verne approximately 30 years after the conclusion of the Xenocides, represents one of the very few direct textual connections between the Lost Legions and the Rangdan conflict. Fleet deployment records provide additional circumstantial evidence. Naval Logistics Archives from the early Great Crusade era document a substantial fleet assigned to the 11th Legion operating in the galactic northeast, precisely the region where the Rangdan would later emerge. These records show the 11th Legion fleet, comprising 3 battle barges and 22 escort vessels, dispatched to investigate anomalous xenos activity in the region that would later be designated the Ghoul Stars. The fleet's last communication, dated approximately 6 months before official recognition of the Rangdan threat, reported contact with structures of non-human origin displaying advanced technological characteristics before all transmissions ceased. When the Rangdan presence was officially acknowledged and the first Xenocide began, there is no record of the 11th Legion being recalled or reassigned. They simply vanish from strategic planning documents and battle reports. This absence is particularly conspicuous given the Imperium's desperate need for Astartes forces during the conflict, suggesting the Legion was already unavailable for deployment. Perhaps the most intriguing evidence comes from psychic impressions recorded by members of the Librarius. Several Dark Angels librarians who survived the Rangdan campaigns reported experiencing recurring visions when operating in certain regions of Rangdan-controlled space. These visions consistently featured Astartes in unfamiliar heraldry, fighting against overwhelming odds, their armor described as midnight blue with silver trim or pale gray with bronze detailing, color schemes that match no known legion but align with fragmentary descriptions of the 11th and 2nd legions respectively. One particularly detailed account comes from Chief Librarian Zahariel, who documented encountering a psychic echo during operations on a Rangdan-held world designated Tenebris 6. He described sensing the final stand of warriors who were brothers, yet not brothers, and the fall of a son of the Emperor, whose name tastes of ashes when I try to speak it. Zahariel's personal journals, later sealed by order of Lion L. Johnson, mentioned that this psychic impression was so powerful it temporarily manifested as visible apparitions that other Astartes in his strike force also witnessed. Medical records provide another avenue of circumstantial evidence. Apothecary logs from the Dark Angels Legion document the retrieval and analysis of gene seed from fallen Astartes during the Rangdan campaigns. Most entries follow standard protocols, identifying the legion of origin and status of the recovered progenid glands. However, several entries from operations deep in Rangdan territory contain anomalous notations such as gene sequence partially consistent with cataloged patterns but showing unknown modifications, or progenid structure indicates Terran origin but matches no recognized legion template. These medical anomalies were apparently significant enough to warrant direct attention from the Emperor. A heavily redacted communication from the Master of the Apothecarian to Terra requests guidance regarding anomalous gene seed recovered from Engagement Zone Delta Epsilon, and notes that the biological markers suggest Legion-grade enhancement, but with structural variations inconsistent with authorized protocols. The Emperor's response is entirely redacted, but subsequent documents show all recovered samples being transferred to sealed containment and transported to Terra under custodian guard. The nature of the Rangdan threat itself provides context for why a legion might be completely expunged from Imperial records. The cerebral parasites and biological subversion capabilities of the Rangdan represented a unique danger to Astartes' forces. Unlike conventional enemies that could kill space marines but not truly corrupt them, the Rangdan possessed the technological means to potentially turn Astartes against the Imperium while leaving them physically intact and apparently unchanged. A scenario in which an entire legion became compromised by Rangdan influence would represent an existential threat to the Great Crusade and the Imperium itself. Such a catastrophe would necessitate not only the elimination of the affected legion, but the systematic erasure of their very existence to prevent knowledge of such vulnerability from undermining confidence in the Astartes as the Emperor's perfect warriors. This theory gains credence from the extreme measures taken to censor information about both the lost legions and the Rangdan. While many tragic defeats and setbacks during the Great Crusade were documented and preserved as lessons for future commanders, these two subjects share the distinction of being systematically expunged rather than merely classified. This parallel treatment suggests a connection between them significant enough to warrant the most extreme censorship protocols available to Imperial authorities. Conversations between surviving Primarchs, recorded in various sources, provide tantalizing hints about the fate of their lost brothers. During a private exchange between Rogel Dorn and Malkador the Sigillite, preserved in the personal journals of a silent sister who was present, Dorn makes reference to the two who were punished and asks if their fate was truly necessary. Malkador's response is partially redacted, but includes the phrase, "The alternative would have been far worse." Sometimes a limb must be amputated to save the body. Similarly, fragmentary records of a conversation between Sanguinius and Horus during the Ulanor triumph include a cryptic exchange where Sanguinius remarks that even in victory, "I cannot forget what happened to Redacted and his legion." Horus reportedly responds that some threats leave no room for mercy or redemption, a statement that takes on new significance when considered alongside what is known about the Rangdan capability for biological subversion. What makes the connection between the Lost Legions and the Rangdan particularly compelling is the specific nature of the censorship applied to both subjects. Imperial censorship typically follows predictable patterns. Military defeats might be downplayed, casualty figures adjusted, or tactical failures recontextualized as strategic withdrawals. But complete excision from historical records is exceedingly rare, reserved for information deemed fundamentally dangerous to the Imperium's continued existence. Both the Lost Legions and the full details of the Rangdan Xenocides fall into this category of absolute censorship, suggesting they share a connection that Imperial authorities consider too dangerous for preservation. This level of information control required coordination between multiple Imperial organizations, including the Mechanicum, the Librarius, the Administratum, and likely the early precursors to the Inquisition, a commitment of resources that would only be justified by the most serious threat to Imperial security. The pattern of redaction surrounding both subjects shows striking similarities. Documents mentioning either topic tend to contain precise excisions, not whole documents destroyed, but specific names, locations, and details removed with surgical precision. This suggests a coordinated censorship effort conducted by individuals with detailed knowledge of exactly what information needed to be concealed, rather than broad suppression of general categories of information. Archaeological evidence provides additional circumstantial connections. Excavations of battlefields from the Rangdan Xenocides occasionally uncover Astartes equipment that defies standard classification. A particularly notable discovery came during Mechanicum exploration of the Dead World Camel, which had been subjected to exterminatus during the later stages of the Second Xenocide. Among the vitrified ruins, tech priests discovered fragments of Astartes' power armor bearing no identifiable legion insignia, but constructed with material compositions and technical specifications that matched no known pattern in Mechanicum archives. Analysis of these fragments revealed them to be constructed using techniques consistent with early Great Crusade manufacturing, but incorporating modifications that suggested adaptation to specific environmental conditions prevalent in the galactic northeast frontier. Most telling was the discovery of partial gene markers embedded in the armor's biological interface systems, a common feature of Astartes equipment that allowed for optimization based on the specific genetic structure of the wearer. These markers corresponded to no known Legion geneseed pattern, but showed unmistakable signs of Terran origin and Emperor-directed design. Despite the compelling nature of this circumstantial evidence, it must be emphasized that no definitive proof exists directly linking either of the Lost Legions to the Rangdan Xenocides. The systematic nature of the information purge has been too thorough to allow for absolute certainty. What remains are shadows and echoes, patterns of absence that themselves form a kind of negative evidence. The conclusion of the Rangdan Xenocides left an indelible scar upon the galaxy's northern reaches. What had once been a promising frontier of Imperial expansion became a region of dead worlds, quarantine zones, and permanent military cordons. The territorial losses suffered by the Imperium during this conflict would not be fully reclaimed for millennia, if ever. In the immediate aftermath of the final Xenocide campaign, specialized Mechanicum survey teams conducted comprehensive assessments of formerly Rangdan-occupied systems. These evaluations, conducted by tech priests equipped with enhanced radiation shielding and biological containment protocols, revealed the true extent of devastation wrought by both Rangdan occupation and the subsequent Imperial purges. Of the 132 star systems directly affected by Rangdan activity, approximately 38% were classified as irredeemably compromised, worlds where Rangdan biological and technological contamination had penetrated so deeply into planetary ecosystems that complete sterilization was deemed the only safe response. These worlds were subjected to exterminatus-grade weapons, including cyclonic torpedoes, virus bombs, and in cases of extreme contamination, two-stage phosphex bombardment followed by atmospheric ignition. The hive world of Themur Secundus exemplified the most severe category of contamination. Once home to 8 billion Imperial citizens, Themur had served as a primary Rangdan processing center during the Second Xenocide. Mechanicum survey teams discovered that Rangdan bioforms had not merely occupied the planet, but fundamentally altered its biosphere. The world's oceans had been transformed into nutrient solutions that sustained vast underwater processing structures, while the atmosphere had been modified to contain high concentrations of specialized spores that facilitated Rangdan communication and control networks. Most disturbing were the discoveries beneath the planet's former hive cities. Extensive tunnel networks housed what biology's adepts designated conversion matrices, massive organic mechanical structures that had processed millions of human captives. Unlike conventional prisons or labor camps, these facilities were designed not to exploit human labor, but to fundamentally reshape human biology. Fragmentary evidence suggested that processed humans had their nervous systems extracted and integrated into Rangdan computational networks, while their remaining biological material was repurposed into new Rangdan bioforms. The contamination of Themur was deemed so severe that standard Exterminatus protocols were considered insufficient. Instead, the Dark Angels deployed a rare weapon from their forbidden arsenal, a device known in classified records only as the Tucholcha engine. The exact nature of this weapon remains heavily censored, but observational data indicates it generated a localized space-time anomaly that effectively removed Themur from normal space-time reference frames. The planet technically still exists, but remains inaccessible through conventional means, trapped in what Mechanicum theorists termed a causality loop that prevents any possibility of Rangdan organisms escaping. Less severely affected worlds underwent intensive decontamination processes rather than outright destruction. These procedures, developed jointly by Dark Angels apothecaries and Mechanicum biology's adepts, targeted the unique biological markers of Rangdan organisms while preserving as much of the original planetary ecosystem as possible. The process typically began with high-altitude dispersal of tailored phage viruses designed to attack Rangdan cellular structures, followed by controlled burning of affected regions, and finally treatment with specialized chemical agents that broke down remaining Rangdan biomaterial at the molecular level. The agri-world of Helios Primus represented a successful implementation of these decontamination protocols. Though approximately 30% of its arable land had been converted to Rangdan use, the contamination remained relatively superficial, confined primarily to surface structures rather than penetrating deep into the planetary crust. After 3 years of intensive decontamination efforts, Helios Primus was declared safe for limited recolonization, though agricultural output remained restricted to specific crops grown under controlled conditions and subject to rigorous testing for signs of Rangdan biological markers. For worlds falling between these extremes, too contaminated for conventional decontamination, but not requiring complete destruction, the Imperium established permanent quarantine zones. These regions, designated interdiction spheres in official documentation, were surrounded by automated monitoring stations, minefields, and patrol routes maintained by specialized Imperial Navy vessels. Entry into these zones was prohibited under penalty of immediate destruction, with no exceptions granted even for high-ranking Imperial officials or Astartes commanders. The most extensive of these quarantine zones encompassed the Ghoul Stars region, where the highest concentration of Rangdan activity had been detected. This vast area, spanning several hundred light-years, was effectively excised from Imperial space through the construction of fortress systems along its borders. These fortresses, primarily garrisoned by Dark Angel's successors after the Legion's later division, maintained constant vigilance against any sign of resurgent Rangdan activity. The quarantine proved so effective that over subsequent millennia, even the specific nature of the threat contained within was gradually forgotten, with later Imperial generations knowing only that something dangerous lay beyond the interdiction perimeter. Beyond physical containment measures, the Imperium implemented comprehensive information quarantine protocols regarding Rangdan technology and biology. Knowledge of Rangdan capabilities was classified at the highest levels, with most information restricted to specialized Ordo Xenos units and senior Mechanicum Biologists adepts. Technical data regarding Rangdan biotechnology was particularly tightly controlled, with research facilities studying recovered samples operating under multiple layers of security and isolation protocols. This information quarantine extended to Imperial military forces that had participated in the conflict. Astartes, who had directly encountered Rangdan forces, underwent extensive psychological screening and, in many cases, selective memory modification to remove detailed knowledge of specific Rangdan capabilities. Imperial army units were typically subjected to more comprehensive memory alteration, with entire campaigns recontextualized as actions against unspecified xenos threats, rather than specifically naming the Rangdan. The territorial losses suffered by the Imperium as a result of the Rangdan Xenocides represented the most significant setback to the Great Crusade's expansion. Prior to the conflict, Imperial cartographic projections had anticipated bringing the entire northern galactic quadrant under compliance within approximately 50 years. The Rangdan Xenocides not only halted this expansion, but forced the abandonment of thousands of light years of previously secured territory. Administratum records indicate that 86 previously compliant human worlds were permanently lost, either through destruction, abandonment, or inclusion within quarantine zones. These worlds had a combined population of approximately 49 billion Imperial citizens, representing one of the largest demographic losses of the Great Crusade era. Beyond these human worlds, the Imperium lost access to 23 significant mining operations on resource-rich planets and 17 promising colony sites that had been in early stages of development. The strategic impact of these losses extended beyond raw numbers. The northern expansion front had been specifically targeted for priority development due to the high concentration of habitable worlds and valuable resources in the region. Mechanicum surveys had identified several planets with rare mineral deposits crucial for advanced technology production, while Imperial colonization planners had designated the region as a potential population pressure release for overcrowded core systems. With this expansion vector effectively closed, Imperial strategic planners were forced to redirect resources toward less optimal regions, particularly the galactic east, where habitable worlds were more sparsely distributed and often required more extensive terraforming before becoming fully productive. This reallocation of resources created cascading delays throughout the Great Crusade's timetable, as expedition fleets originally intended for northern deployment were reassigned to eastern vectors, where they encountered different challenges requiring specialized equipment and tactics. The loss of established supply lines and forward bases in the northern regions also created significant logistical challenges for remaining Imperial operations in adjacent sectors. Fleet elements operating near the newly established quarantine zones found their support infrastructure suddenly removed, necessitating longer supply lines from core systems and reducing operational tempo. In several documented cases, expeditionary fleets were forced to abandon promising compliance actions due to supply constraints resulting from the strategic realignment. Perhaps most significant was the impact on Imperial military doctrine and organizational structure. The Rangdan Xenocides demonstrated vulnerabilities in the Imperium's approach to unknown threats, particularly those capable of infiltration and subversion rather than direct confrontation. In response, the Emperor authorized the creation of specialized counter-infiltration units within both the Astartes legions and the broader Imperial military structure. These units, operating under direct authority from Terra rather than standard command hierarchies, were tasked with developing and implementing protocols specifically designed to detect and eliminate subtle xenos influences before they could spread. the Dark Angels Legion underwent particularly significant organizational changes following the Xenocides. Their pre-existing wing structure was formalized and expanded, with specialized formations like the Dreadwing and Firewing gaining prominence. These wings operated semi-autonomously, developing expertise in specific aspects of warfare that had proven effective against the Rangdan. This organizational model would later influence the chapter structure implemented during the Second Founding, with many First Legion successors maintaining specialized companies focused on particular tactical domains. For the broader Imperium, the Rangdan Xenocides established precedents for dealing with existential xenos threats that would inform policy for millennia to come. The concept of exterminatus, previously considered an extreme measure of last resort, became codified as a standard response to certain categories of xenos contamination. Similarly, the practice of establishing permanent quarantine zones around regions of suspected xenos activity became standard Imperial policy, leading to the creation of numerous interdiction perimeters throughout the galaxy. The long-term ecological impact on affected worlds created environmental challenges that would persist for millennia. Planets subjected to less than complete exterminatus often developed unique and dangerous ecological niches in the aftermath of Rangdan occupation and subsequent Imperial cleansing. On worlds where Rangdan biological material had not been completely eradicated, periodic outbreaks of mutated organisms occurred as residual Rangdan genetic material interacted with native life forms. These outbreaks necessitated ongoing monitoring and periodic cleansing operations, further straining Imperial resources in the region. Mechanicum studies of these biological interactions yielded disturbing insights into the adaptive capabilities of Rangdan organisms. Even in fragmentary or degraded states, Rangdan biological material demonstrated remarkable resilience and an apparent programmed drive to recombine and evolve. This led to the implementation of specialized containment protocols for worlds with confirmed Rangdan biological residue, including regular orbital scans for unauthorized biological activity and immediate sterilization responses to any detected anomalies. The psychological impact on Imperial populations near the quarantine zones cannot be overlooked. Worlds that had witnessed Rangdan activity, even tangentially, developed cultural patterns shaped by this proximity to horror. Many developed societal structures characterized by heightened vigilance, suspicion of outsiders, and elaborate purification rituals. Imperial cult practices in these regions often emphasized themes of purity and contamination, with local variations focusing on the identification and elimination of hidden corruption, a clear psychological response to the infiltration tactics of the Rangdan. In the centuries following the Xenocides, several worlds along the quarantine perimeter reported phenomena, suggesting continued Rangdan influence despite containment efforts. These incidents, documented in sealed inquisitorial archives, included cases of unusual technological artifacts appearing in frontier settlements, isolated outbreaks of parasitic organisms bearing similarities to Rangdan bioforms, and occasional reports of unidentified vessels briefly penetrating Imperial detection grids before disappearing again. While none of these incidents developed into full-scale incursions, they necessitated ongoing vigilance and periodic reinforcement of quarantine measures. The most significant such incident occurred approximately 300 years after the final Xenocide campaign, when a Dark Angels patrol fleet encountered what appeared to be a damaged Rangdan vessel drifting near the edge of the Ghoul Star's quarantine zone. The vessel was captured and placed under heavy guard for transport to a secure research facility. During transit, however, the ship's biological components began rapid and unexpected regeneration, necessitating emergency containment protocols. The incident ended with the deliberate detonation of the transport vessel's warp drive, destroying both ships and all research personnel aboard. Following this event, quarantine protocols were significantly strengthened, with additional monitoring stations and patrol routes established throughout the perimeter region. The third Rangdan Xenocide erupted in the year 889 of the 30th millennium, following nearly a decade of uneasy containment along the boundaries established after the Second Xenocide. What began as isolated incidents of sensor anomalies and communication disruptions along the quarantine perimeter rapidly escalated into a full-scale offensive that threatened to overwhelm Imperial defenses. Unlike previous Rangdan campaigns that had focused on gradual infiltration and subversion, this final push demonstrated a level of desperation previously unseen in Rangdan strategy, a last, furious attempt to break the Imperial containment before their resources were exhausted. The first indication of renewed Rangdan activity came when Mechanicum monitoring stations in the Ghoul Stars region detected unusual gravitational fluctuations consistent with mass displacement technology. These readings, initially dismissed as equipment malfunctions, soon correlated with the disappearance of 3 Imperial patrol vessels tasked with quarantine enforcement. When a follow-up investigation fleet arrived at the last known coordinates of the missing ships, they discovered only debris fields containing components that showed evidence of exposure to some form of molecular dissolution agent that had reduced metal alloys to their constituent elements. Lion L. Johnson, who had maintained personal oversight of the quarantine zone since the conclusion of the Second Xenocide, immediately recognized these incidents as precursors to a larger offensive. Drawing on lessons from previous encounters, the Primarch ordered the implementation of Contingency Protocol Obsidian, a defensive readiness plan that had been meticulously developed based on observed Rangdan attack patterns. The Dark Angel's response was swift and comprehensive. 6 full companies were redeployed from compliance operations in neighboring sectors, while specialized detection equipment developed by Mechanicum Magi specifically to identify Rangdan biological signatures was distributed to all Imperial outposts along the quarantine boundary. Most significantly, the Lion activated the Legion's specialized Dreadwing formations, elite units equipped with esoteric weaponry specifically designed to combat Rangdan bioforms. These preparations proved prescient when, 3 weeks later, simultaneous attacks struck 17 monitoring stations along a 200-light-year arc of the quarantine perimeter. The coordinated nature of these strikes indicated a level of strategic planning that Imperial commanders had not witnessed since the height of the Second Xenocide. More concerning was the appearance of new Rangdan morphotypes that displayed capabilities not documented in previous encounters. Picked captures from the few stations that managed to transmit data before being overwhelmed showed Rangdan assault forms with integrated phase technology that allowed them to temporarily shift partially out of real space, passing through solid barriers before rematerializing to attack defenders. These entities, designated face castes in subsequent Imperial reports, proved nearly impossible to defend against using conventional fortifications, as they simply passed through walls and armor before solidifying within defended positions. The most detailed account of these new threats came from Mago's explorator Delvis, who survived the attack on monitoring station Theta 9 by sealing himself within a stasis vault designed for the preservation of dangerous artifacts. His report, recovered when Dark Angel's forces reclaimed the station 3 days later, described the face castes as humanoid in basic configuration, but with grotesque anatomical distortions, including elongated limbs with too many joints and torsos that appeared to contain multiple redundant organ systems visible through translucent dermal layers. Most disturbing was Delvis's observation that these entities appeared to be at least partially constructed from genetically modified human tissue. Biological markers consistent with Astartes gene enhancement were detected in tissue samples recovered from damaged face castes, suggesting the Rangdan had somehow acquired and repurposed genetic material from Space Marines lost during previous engagements. This revelation sent shockwaves through Imperial command structures, as it implied a level of biological sophistication that could potentially threaten the genetic security of the Astartes themselves. The initial Rangdan breakthrough created a salient approximately 30 light-years deep into Imperial territory, threatening several populated systems that had been recolonized following the Second Xenocide. Lion L. Johnson responded by implementing a strategy of channeled withdrawal, sacrificing specific worlds to create killing grounds where Rangdan forces could be engaged under favorable conditions, while evacuating civilian populations from systems directly in the path of the advance. The Forge world of Zana II, which had been instrumental in developing specialized weapons against the Rangdan, became the focal point of Imperial defensive efforts. The Dark Angels deployed nearly 30,000 Astartes to reinforce the planet's defenses, supported by elements from Mechanicum Titan legions and specialized Ordo Reductor siege units. The planet's manufacturing capabilities were redirected entirely toward producing anti-Rangdan weaponry, with forge complexes operating at maximum capacity to supply not only the defenders on Zana II, but also Imperial forces throughout the threatened sector. The Lion personally oversaw the construction of layered defensive positions designed specifically to counter the phase capabilities of the new Rangdan morphotypes. These defenses incorporated Gellar field technology adapted from Void ship warp protection systems, creating zones where phasing became impossible or highly dangerous for the Rangdan. Additionally, specialized weapons developed by Mechanicum weaponsmiths under Astartes supervision included gravitic disruptors that could force phased entities back into normal space, where they became vulnerable to conventional attacks. The anticipated Rangdan assault on Zana II began in the early months of 890, with a force that Imperial augur arrays estimated to include over 300 Rangdan vessels of various configurations. The Void battle lasted 17 days, with Dark Angel's fleet elements employing hit-and-run tactics to whittle down the Rangdan numbers, while avoiding direct confrontation with their largest ships. This approach, while effective at reducing enemy strength, could not prevent the eventual landing of Rangdan forces on the planet's surface. The ground war that followed represented one of the largest single engagements of the entire Xenocide campaign. Dark Angel's forces, organized into specialized task groups, engaged Rangdan units across 7 major combat theaters spanning the planet's primary continent. The 1st Legion's elite Deathwing formations spearheaded counter-attacks against Rangdan breakthrough points, while Dreadwing units deployed forbidden weaponry to sterilize areas of confirmed Rangdan biological contamination. Particularly notable was the deployment of the mysterious Exindio units, artificial intelligence constructs of Dark Age origin that the Dark Angels had maintained in stasis since the early Great Crusade. These forbidden weapons, resembling heavily armed and armored automatons, demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict and counter Rangdan tactical adaptations. Imperial forces operating alongside the Exindio reported that the constructs appeared to communicate with each other through means undetectable to standard equipment, coordinating their actions with a precision that even Astartes could not match. The battle reached its climax when a concentrated Rangdan push threatened to overwhelm the central forge complexes, where the most critical anti-Rangdan weapon production was located. With conventional defenses failing, Lion El'Jonson authorized the deployment of weapons previously sealed under his direct authority, devices recovered from Dark Age vaults that had been deemed too dangerous for regular use, even against the most severe threats. Among these was the device designated in classified records only as the Tucholcha engine, an artifact of unknown origin capable of manipulating local space-time geometry. The Lion personally oversaw its activation, using it to create a localized temporal distortion that trapped the main Rangdan assault force in a bubble of accelerated time. Within this field, the Rangdan experienced the passage of weeks in what was merely hours for the defenders, causing their biological components to age rapidly and their energy reserves to deplete at an accelerated rate. When the field was deactivated, the Rangdan forces had been reduced to withered, non-functional organisms that were easily eliminated by conventional weapons. This decisive intervention broke the momentum of the Rangdan assault on Zana II, forcing them to withdraw and regroup. The victory, while significant, came at a terrible cost. Approximately 5,000 Dark Angels Astartes had fallen during the defense, along with tens of thousands of Mechanicum personnel and Imperial army troops. More concerning were the after effects of the Tucholcha engine's deployment. The space-time distortion had created lingering anomalies throughout the battlefield, with reports of troops experiencing temporal dislocations, objects aging or de-aging without apparent cause, and in some cases, duplicates of individuals appearing briefly before fading from existence. These phenomena necessitated a comprehensive quarantine of the affected regions, with specialized mechanicum and librarious personnel working to stabilize the worst anomalies. The victory at Zona II marked the turning point of the Third Xenocide, with their main assault blunted and their new morphotypes proven vulnerable to the specialized countermeasures developed by Imperial forces. The Rangdan offensive lost momentum. The Lion seized this opportunity to launch a counter-offensive aimed not merely at pushing back the Rangdan advance, but at eliminating their presence entirely from the region's bordering Imperial space. This final phase of the campaign saw the Dark Angels employing increasingly extreme measures to ensure complete eradication of the Rangdan threat. Worlds that showed any sign of Rangdan contamination were subjected to systematic sterilization, with specialized destroyer squads deploying rad weapons, phosphex, and viral agents designed to eliminate all biological material down to the microscopic level. These operations were conducted with cold efficiency, prioritizing absolute certainty of xenocide over preservation of potentially salvageable resources. The most significant engagement of this counter-offensive occurred in the Golgothan Wastes, where Imperial intelligence had identified what appeared to be a primary Rangdan command node. This installation, built into an asteroid field surrounding a dying star, represented the most concentrated Rangdan presence encountered since the initial outbreak of the Xenocides. Assault on such a heavily defended position would have been suicidal using conventional approaches. Instead, the Lion implemented what Imperial strategists would later term a compound vector attack, multiple, seemingly unrelated operations that were in fact components of a single coordinated plan. Dark Angel's fleet elements conducted diversionary attacks on secondary Rangdan installations throughout the sector, while specialized infiltration teams inserted onto the outer asteroids of the field began planting phase-shifted demolition charges designed to avoid detection by Rangdan sensors. Simultaneously, a specialized strike force led by the Lion himself approached the command node, using captured Rangdan vessels that had been extensively modified by Mechanicum tech priests to mask the life signs of their Astartes occupants. This deception allowed them to penetrate deep into the asteroid field before being detected, at which point the planted charges were detonated, creating massive debris fields that disabled many of the installation's defensive systems. The ensuing battle lasted 3 days and represented some of the most brutal close-quarters fighting of the entire Xenocide campaign. Dark Angel's forces, equipped with specialized void combat gear and weapons designed specifically to combat Rangdan biological systems, fought their way through the labyrinthine interior of the command node. They encountered not only standard Rangdan morphotypes, but also what appeared to be experimental forms that displayed capabilities not previously documented. Most disturbing were entities designated Slogth murder minds, massive, worm-like congregations that appeared to function as control nodes for surrounding Rangdan organisms. These entities possessed powerful psychic capabilities that could overwhelm even trained Astartes minds, necessitating the deployment of Dark Angel's librarians equipped with specialized psychic dampening technology to counter their influence. The battle culminated in the central chamber of the installation, where the Lion and his Deathwing companions confronted what Imperial records describe only as the primary intelligence, an entity of such alien nature that conventional description proved inadequate. What is known is that the Lion engaged this entity in personal combat for nearly 7 hours, during which time the chamber was sealed and no communications were permitted in or out. When the chamber was finally opened, the Lion emerged alone, bearing wounds that would have killed even an Astartes of lesser constitution. The primary intelligence had been destroyed, though at significant cost. 3 of the Lion's Deathwing companions had fallen, and the Primarch himself would require extensive medical intervention to recover from his injuries. With the destruction of the command node, Rangdan resistance throughout the sector collapsed with unexpected suddenness. It became apparent that the various Rangdan organisms had been operating as extensions of the central intelligence rather than truly independent entities. Without its coordinating influence, they reverted to simpler, more predictable patterns of behavior that were easily countered by Imperial forces. The final phase of the Third Xenocide involved the systematic cleansing of all regions that had experienced Rangdan activity. This process was conducted with methodical thoroughness, with specialized Dark Angels units sweeping each system to ensure no trace of Rangdan biological material remained. Worlds that could not be completely purified were subjected to exterminatus, with approximately 23 planets destroyed outright to prevent any possibility of Rangdan resurgence. In the aftermath of the final campaign, permanent defensive positions were established along the borders of what had been Rangdan-controlled space. These installations, heavily armed and constantly manned by rotating Dark Angels detachments, were designed not merely to detect and respond to potential incursions, but to serve as bases for regular sweeps into the former Rangdan territory to ensure no resurgence occurred. The most substantial of these defensive networks was the Halo Array, a series of interconnected monitoring stations, automated weapon platforms, and garrison bases spanning the region that would later become known as the Ghoul Stars. This defensive perimeter represented one of the largest permanent military installations of the Great Crusade era, requiring significant ongoing resource commitment to maintain. The Lion personally oversaw its construction and initial operation protocols, ensuring that the defenses incorporated all lessons learned during the Xenocide campaigns. The shockwaves of the Rangdan Xenocides reverberated throughout the Great Crusade in ways that fundamentally altered its trajectory. What had begun as humanity's triumphant reclamation of the stars transformed into a more cautious, militarized expansion marked by heightened vigilance against xenos threats. The unprecedented commitment of resources to the northern campaigns created ripple effects that would be felt across Imperial operations for decades to come. The most immediate impact was the dramatic reorganization of Legion deployments necessitated by the catastrophic casualties suffered during the campaigns. The Dark Angels, once the largest and most powerful of the Emperor's legions, with an estimated strength of nearly 200,000 Astartes before the Xenocides, emerged from the conflict severely depleted. Conservative estimates placed their losses at approximately 50,000 warriors, though some sources suggest the true figure may have been significantly higher. This reduction transformed the Legion from the preeminent Astartes force to merely one among equals, fundamentally altering the power dynamics between the legions. The operational consequences of these losses became immediately apparent in the years following the Third Xenocide. Expedition fleets that had previously been supported by full Dark Angels contingents now received only token forces or none at all. Compliance actions that would have been spearheaded by 1st Legion Astartes were reassigned to other legions, many of which lacked the specialized experience and equipment that had made the Dark Angels so effective in certain operational contexts. This redistribution of responsibilities created a cascade of adjustments throughout Imperial military planning. The Ultramarines under Robute Guilliman assumed many of the large-scale compliance operations previously assigned to the Dark Angels, accelerating their growth into the largest legion. The Imperial Fists found themselves increasingly tasked with establishing permanent defensive positions rather than participating in front-line expansion, a role that would eventually become central to their legion identity. The Night Lords, despite concerns about their methods, received authorization to conduct independent compliance operations in sectors previously designated for joint actions with Dark Angels oversight. Beyond simple numbers, the Rangdan Xenocides created significant gaps in specialized capabilities within the Imperial war machine. The Dark Angels had maintained numerous specialized formations with unique skills and equipment specifically developed for particular operational contexts. Many of these units had been effectively wiped out during the Xenocides, taking with them institutional knowledge and combat techniques that could not be quickly replaced. The Dreadwing, which had been particularly active during anti-Rangdan operations, lost nearly 70% of its veteran members. This formation had specialized in the deployment of esoteric weaponry against targets resistant to conventional attacks, a capability that proved difficult to replicate when similar threats emerged in other sectors. Mechanicum archives document numerous requests from expeditionary fleet commanders for Dreadwing support in the years following the Xenocides, with most receiving the response that no qualified units were available for deployment. Similarly, the Dark Angels Firewing, specialists in covert operations and counter-infiltration, suffered losses that severely hampered Imperial capabilities against subversive threats. This formation had developed unique protocols for identifying and neutralizing infiltrators that proved impossible to quickly transmit to other Imperial forces, creating vulnerabilities that would later be exploited by various enemies of mankind. The material cost of the Xenocides extended far beyond Astartes' casualties. The Dark Angels Legion had committed virtually its entire arsenal to the northern campaigns, including rare weapons and vehicles dating back to the Unification Wars on Terra. Many of these irreplaceable assets were lost in desperate last stands or sacrificial actions to contain Rangdan breakouts. Forge records from Mars document extensive requests for replacement equipment in the aftermath of the Xenocides, with many specialized items marked as pattern discontinued or template lost, indicating that the technological knowledge to reproduce them no longer existed. Particularly significant was the loss of specialized anti-psyker equipment that had proven effective against the psychic capabilities of Rangdan command organisms. The Dark Angels had deployed nearly their entire inventory of such devices during the final stages of the third Xenocide, with most being destroyed in the process. When similar capabilities were later encountered among other xenos species, Imperial forces found themselves lacking the specialized countermeasures that might have reduced casualties and improved operational outcomes. The strategic redeployment of forces following the Xenocides created significant gaps in Imperial presence throughout multiple sectors, with the Dark Angels focused on rebuilding their strength and maintaining the quarantine around former Rangdan territory. Regions that had previously benefited from their protection found themselves with minimal Astartes support. This necessitated a fundamental reassessment of Imperial expansion priorities, with some frontier regions effectively abandoned to focus resources on more defensible territories. The 19th Expeditionary Fleet, operating in the galactic northwest, provides a clear example of this strategic realignment. Prior to the Xenocides, this fleet had been supported by a full battle company of Dark Angels Astartes, allowing it to undertake compliance actions against heavily defended human worlds and moderate xenos threats. In the aftermath of the conflict, the Dark Angels contingent was reduced to a single squad, forcing the fleet to significantly scale back its operations. Systems that had been marked for priority compliance were designated observation only status, effectively postponing Imperial integration indefinitely. Similar situations played out across dozens of expeditionary fleets, creating a pattern of contraction rather than expansion along multiple frontiers. The Adeptus Munitorum records from this period show a 38% reduction in new compliance actions in the 5 years following the third Xenocide compared to the 5 years preceding the first Xenocide. This reduction represented not merely a pause in Imperial expansion, but a fundamental shift in the Great Crusade's momentum, a transformation from confident advance to cautious consolidation. The psychological impact on Imperial military doctrine was perhaps even more significant than the material losses. The Rangdan had demonstrated vulnerabilities in Astartes' capabilities that many had previously considered unassailable. Space Marines, created to be the Emperor's perfect warriors, had proven susceptible to Rangdan biological subversion and psychological manipulation. This revelation prompted a comprehensive reassessment of Astartes' deployment protocols, particularly regarding exposure to unknown xenos capabilities. New doctrinal guidelines established in the aftermath of the Xenocides emphasized containment and study before direct engagement with previously unencountered xenos species. Expeditionary fleets were instructed to maintain quarantine protocols around newly discovered xenos civilizations, until specialized Mechanicum and Astartes assessment teams could evaluate potential threats, particularly those of a biological or psychic nature. This more cautious approach, while prudent given the lessons of the Rangdan campaigns, significantly slowed the pace of Imperial expansion in regions with high xenos population density. The Xenocides also prompted a reassessment of the Imperium's approach to human worlds, showing signs of genetic deviation or technological corruption. Prior to the conflict, the Great Crusade had generally approached such worlds with an emphasis on compliance and integration where possible. The experience with Rangdan infiltration created a much lower tolerance for biological or technological aberration, with many worlds that might previously have been brought to compliance instead subjected to purification or even exterminatus. This doctrinal shift is evident in the treatment of the Osiris cluster, a group of human-settled worlds discovered in 895. These planets had maintained relative isolation during the Age of Strife, developing unique biological enhancement technologies that, while not inherently hostile to Imperial ideology, deviated significantly from sanctioned patterns. Pre-Xenocide protocols would likely have designated these worlds for specialized compliance actions aimed at gradually bringing their practices into alignment with Imperial standards. Instead, citing unacceptable biological divergence patterns reminiscent of xenos corruption, the cluster was subjected to immediate military action, with 3 worlds sterilized entirely and the remaining populations subjected to forced relocation and medical purging of all enhancements. The Rangdan campaigns also fundamentally altered the Imperium's approach to information security and compartmentalization. The Rangdan had demonstrated an unprecedented ability to extract and utilize information from captured Imperial personnel and systems, forcing a reevaluation of knowledge distribution throughout the Imperial military hierarchy. New protocols established in the aftermath of the Xenocides created much stricter information boundaries between different branches of Imperial service, with many technologies and tactical approaches restricted to specific formations rather than being widely disseminated. This compartmentalization, while reducing vulnerabilities to infiltration and information extraction, created significant operational challenges for joint Imperial actions. Expeditionary fleets, which had previously operated with relatively open information sharing between Astartes, Imperial Army, and Mechanicum elements, now found themselves navigating complex security protocols that often hindered effective coordination. Reports from fleet commanders during this period frequently mentioned delays and miscommunications resulting from inability to access information restricted to other service branches. The experience against the Rangdan also influenced the development of specialized Imperial formations designed to counter similar threats in the future. The Ordo Reductor, a subdivision of the Mechanicum focused on siege warfare and specialized weapons development, received significant expansion in the aftermath of the Xenocides. Their mandate was broadened to include the development of countermeasures against biological subversion and infiltration, leading to the creation of several new weapon systems, specifically designed to detect and eliminate subtle xenos influences. Similarly, the Librarius formations within various Astartes legions saw their roles expanded beyond direct combat applications of psychic abilities. New protocols established after the Xenocides emphasized detection and counter-infiltration capabilities, with specialized training developed based on techniques that had proven effective against Rangdan psychic influence. Librarians increasingly served as security specialists within their legions, regularly scanning both Astartes and support personnel for signs of external influence or contamination. The strategic consequences of committing so many resources to the northern campaigns extended beyond military considerations to affect the political and economic development of the nascent Imperium. Forge worlds that had been dedicated to producing specialized equipment for anti-Rangdan operations found themselves with excess production capacity once the conflict concluded, creating economic disruptions that required significant administrative intervention to address. Some of these facilities were repurposed for civilian production, while others were mothballed or converted to produce different military equipment, often at considerable expense. The administrative structures developed to coordinate the multi-legion response to the Rangdan threat left a lasting imprint on Imperial organizational models. The Rangdan Operational Strategic Command had demonstrated the effectiveness of centralized coordination for large-scale operations, providing a template that would later influence the development of various Imperial command structures. Elements of ROSC protocols regarding information sharing, resource allocation, and chain of command would eventually be incorporated into standard Adeptus Munitorum procedures for managing multi-legion deployments. Perhaps most significantly, the Rangdan Xenocides created precedents for extreme measures that would later become standard components of Imperial doctrine. The willingness to sacrifice entire human worlds to prevent xenos contamination, the deployment of forbidden weapons against existential threats, and the systematic erasure of information deemed too dangerous for preservation all became established practices during the Xenocides. These precedents would later be cited to justify similar actions against other enemies of mankind, gradually normalizing approaches that had initially been considered extraordinary emergency measures. The quarantine protocols established around former Rangdan territory required ongoing commitment of significant Imperial resources, creating a permanent drain on military capabilities that might otherwise have been directed toward expansion or compliance actions. The Ghoul Star's cordon, as the quarantine zone came to be known, tied down substantial naval assets and required regular Astartes patrols to maintain its integrity. Even 10 years after the conclusion of the Third Xenocide, approximately 8% of total Dark Angel's strength remained permanently assigned to quarantine enforcement duties, with similar commitments from Imperial Navy and Army formations. The technological developments spurred by the Rangdan conflict had wide-ranging implications for Imperial capabilities. The specialized detection equipment created to identify Rangdan biological agents found applications against other subtle xenos threats, while the containment protocols developed for Rangdan specimens established new standards for handling dangerous biological materials. Mechanicum Biologica's divisions that had focused on understanding and countering Rangdan life forms redirected their expertise toward broader xenobiological research, significantly advancing Imperial knowledge in this domain. The term pale wasting first appears in Imperial records nearly 1,000 years after the conclusion of the Rangdan Xenocides. Found in fragmentary texts from the late 31st millennium, it refers to an unspecified calamity that apparently required the deployment of over a dozen Space Marine chapters to contain. What makes this reference particularly intriguing is its geographic association with the Ghoul Stars, the precise region quarantined following the Rangdan campaigns. Inquisitorial analyses of these references suggest a possible resurgence of Rangdan organisms or similar threats that had somehow survived the purges of the Xenocides. The designation pale aligns with surviving descriptions of certain Rangdan morphotypes, particularly the face castes encountered during the Third Xenocide, which were characterized by their pallid, translucent appearance. The term wasting accurately describes the effect of Rangdan parasites on infected populations, a gradual consumption and repurposing of biological material. The timing of the pale wasting incident, occurring during a period when the quarantine protocols established after the Xenocides had been maintained for centuries, but perhaps with decreasing vigilance, suggests a containment failure rather than a new threat. Several Dark Angels successor chapters, including the Angels of Absolution and the Consecrators, maintain extensive records of operations in the Ghoul Stars region during this period, though most details remain sealed even from high-ranking Imperial authorities. What little information has survived suggests the pale wasting represented a significant enough threat to warrant the deployment of specialized weapon systems not seen since the Great Crusade era. Mechanicum archives contain requisition orders for devices designated molecular disassemblers and phase shift disruptors, technologies bearing striking similarities to those deployed against the Rangdan during the original Xenocides. The most compelling evidence linking the Pale Wasting to Rangdan remnants comes from a heavily redacted report by Inquisitor Glavius Roth of the Ordo Xenos, dated approximately 200 years after the incident. The report references biological samples recovered from the wasting zone that displayed cellular structures and adaptive patterns consistent with prohibited xenoform designate R7. This designation appears in no publicly accessible Imperial taxonomic system, but cross-referencing with sealed inquisitorial archives reveals R7 as one of the classification codes applied to Rangdan biological material. Whether the Pale Wasting represented a true resurgence of the Rangdan or merely a similar threat exploiting the same region of space remains officially unresolved. What is clear is that the response to this incident reinforced the quarantine protocols around the Ghoul stars and established additional layers of defense that remain in place into the 41st millennium. The lasting impact of the Rangdan Xenocides on Imperial policy regarding certain classes of xenos threats cannot be overstated. Before the Rangdan campaigns, the Imperium's approach to xenos species typically fell into relatively straightforward categories. Primitive species might be contained or even preserved on reservations, while advanced hostile species were targeted for military elimination. The Rangdan, however, created a new classification of threat that required specialized containment and response protocols. The Ordo Xenos, established during the reforms following the Horus heresy, incorporated many lessons from the Rangdan campaigns into its foundational doctrines. Particularly influential was the concept of infiltration potential, a metric for assessing a xenos species' capacity to subvert Imperial populations through biological, psychological, or technological means rather than direct military confrontation. Species designated with high infiltration potential receive treatment fundamentally different from other xenos threats. Rather than standard military response, such designations trigger specialized protocols including information quarantine, deployment of psychically shielded operatives, and authorization for immediate exterminatus without the usual requirements for escalation of force. These protocols, originally developed specifically for Rangdan containment, have since been applied to various xenos threats, including certain Atrud migrations, Q-oral expansions, and suspected Sloth activity. The biological security measures implemented during the Xenocides established precedents that continue to influence Imperial approaches to contamination and quarantine. The multi-tiered containment protocols, developed for worlds with suspected Rangdan presence, became the template for the Inquisition's extremis diabolis quarantine designations, classifications that effectively remove worlds from Imperial records and establish permanent cordons around them. Perhaps most significant was the establishment of acceptable loss calculations regarding human populations potentially exposed to certain categories of xenos influence. The willingness to sacrifice billions of Imperial citizens to prevent the spread of Rangdan contamination created a strategic precedent that has been invoked countless times in subsequent millennia. Inquisitorial justifications for planetary purges frequently cite the Rangdan containment protocols, even when the specific details of those protocols remain classified to the Inquisitors themselves. The institutional memory of the Rangdan threat also influenced the development of specialized Imperial organizations. The Death Watch, the chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos, incorporates training specifically designed to counter infiltration-capable species, with certain watch fortresses maintaining sealed vaults containing information and equipment dating back to the Xenocides. The watch fortress known as Blackvein, located at the edge of the Ghoul Stars, continues to run regular patrol and containment operations based on protocols established directly after the Rangdan campaigns, though few of its battle brothers understand the true historical origin of these duties. The limited information available to even high-ranking Imperial authorities in the 41st millennium regarding the Rangdan Xenocides represents one of the most successful information quarantines in Imperial history. The systematic purging of records began immediately following the conclusion of the Third Xenocide and continued through subsequent reorganizations of Imperial authority, creating layers of redaction and misinformation that obscure even the basic facts of the conflict. This information control extends beyond simple classification to include active countermeasures against investigation. Inquisitors who have attempted to compile comprehensive accounts of the Xenocides frequently report unexpected obstruction from other Imperial organizations, including the Adeptus Mechanicus, certain first founding chapters, and even other inquisitorial ordos. In several documented cases, inquisitors pursuing information about the Rangdan have been reassigned, their research confiscated, or in extreme cases, have disappeared entirely. What makes this information quarantine particularly effective is its implementation across multiple independent Imperial organizations, suggesting coordination at the highest levels. The Administratum maintains no accessible records of fleet deployments or resource allocation for the campaigns, while Mechanicum archives contain only fragmented technical data with all contextual information removed. Even the Imperial Navy, typically meticulous in documenting void engagements, shows suspicious gaps in its historical records precisely corresponding to major Rangdan fleet actions. The few Imperial authorities with access to substantive information about the Xenocides include a small circle of chapter masters from First Legion successors, certain Magos biologists with specialized research focus, and a handful of senior inquisitors within the Ordo Xenos. Even among these individuals, knowledge is highly compartmentalized, with each possessing pieces of information, but none having a complete picture. This fragmentation of knowledge serves a strategic purpose beyond mere secrecy. By ensuring no single individual or organization possesses comprehensive understanding of the Rangdan, the architects of this information quarantine created a system resistant to infiltration or compromise. An entity seeking to access this knowledge would need to penetrate multiple independent Imperial organizations simultaneously, a practical impossibility even for the most sophisticated adversary. For most Imperial authorities in the 41st millennium, the Rangdan exist as little more than a name, one of many xenos species purged during the Great Crusade, notable perhaps for requiring direct Primarch intervention, but otherwise unremarkable. Even Space Marine chapter masters outside the Dark Angel's successors typically know only that the Rangdan were a significant threat eliminated by the combined efforts of multiple legions, with no appreciation for the existential danger they represented or the extreme measures required to contain them. The memory of the Rangdan Xenocides continues to influence Imperial strategic thinking in ways that extend beyond specific policies or protocols. The experience of facing an enemy that could not be defeated through conventional military superiority, an adversary that turned the Imperium's strength against itself through infiltration and subversion, created a lasting paranoia within certain branches of Imperial leadership. This institutional caution manifests most clearly in the approach to unknown xenos species encountered at the fringes of Imperial space. Where the pre-Rangdan Imperium might have established observation posts or even attempted communication with newly discovered intelligent xenos, the post-Xenocide protocols typically default to immediate quarantine and eventual purging. The possibility that a species might possess Rangdan-like infiltration capabilities is considered sufficient justification for preemptive exterminatus, even without evidence of hostile intent. The strategic emphasis on containment rather than merely military victory represents another lasting influence. Imperial planning for major xenos incursions now routinely includes detailed quarantine protocols implemented concurrently with direct military response. These protocols typically extend far beyond the actual zone of conflict to include populations with even minimal potential exposure to the xenos' influence, creating multiple layers of defense against infiltration or contamination. This containment-focused approach is particularly evident in the Imperial response to Tyranid hive fleets. While the Tyranids present a fundamentally different threat than the Rangdan, the protocols developed for preventing the spread of Rangdan influence proved readily adaptable to containing genestealer infiltration. The willingness to sacrifice entire worlds as firebreaks against Tyranid advancement has clear precedent in the strategies employed during the Xenocides. The Dark Angels and their successor chapters maintain the most direct connection to the memory of the Rangdan campaigns. Though even these chapters have lost much specific knowledge through the millennia, they preserve certain operational doctrines and organizational structures directly descended from those developed during the Xenocides. The emphasis on specialized wings with distinct tactical functions, the maintenance of unique weapons technologies outside standard Imperial patterns, and the culture of internal secrecy all have roots in the chapter's experience against the Rangdan. Most significant is the Dark Angels' continued commitment to maintaining the quarantine around the Ghoul Stars region. While this duty is now shared among multiple chapters and Imperial organizations, the First Legion's successors retain primary responsibility for certain key monitoring stations and patrol routes. Chapter records describe these assignments as the Unforgetting Vigil, a duty passed down through generations of battle brothers without full explanation of its purpose or origin. The specialized equipment maintained by these chapters for their quarantine duties offers tantalizing hints about the nature of the threat they contain. Phase shift detectors, biological contamination scanners, and specialized weapons designed to combat entities with rapid adaptive capabilities suggest continued concern about Rangdan-like organisms rather than conventional xenos threats. The Angels of Absolution maintain a dedicated forge facility producing ammunition containing rare earth elements known to disrupt certain types of biomechanical interfaces, technology with no obvious application against currently active xenos species, but highly effective against the biological technology documented in fragmentary Rangdan records. In the 41st millennium, as the Imperium faces unprecedented threats on multiple fronts, the lessons of the Rangdan Xenocides have taken on renewed significance. The fall of Cadia and the subsequent formation of the Great Rift have stretched Imperial defensive capabilities to their limit, creating vulnerabilities in monitoring and quarantine systems throughout the galaxy. Reports of increased activity in the Ghoul Stars region, though unconfirmed, have prompted the deployment of additional resources to reinforce the ancient containment protocols. Most concerning are accounts from rogue traders operating near the edges of the quarantine zone who describe encountering vessels of unusual configuration that appear to phase partially in and out of real space, a capability disturbingly similar to that documented in Rangdan ships during the Xenocides. While the Inquisition has officially dismissed these reports as misidentification of known phenomena, the Dark Angels and several of their successor chapters have quietly increased their patrol activities in the region. As the Imperium enters perhaps the most perilous period in its long history, the memory of the Rangdan Xenocides serves as both warning and guide. The threat contained through such tremendous sacrifice during the Great Crusade represents a template for the kind of existential danger that can threaten even a galactic civilization. More importantly, the successful containment of that threat, despite its terrible cost, offers a model for how the Imperium might weather its current storms, through unflinching commitment to security, willingness to make necessary sacrifices, and the strategic foresight to recognize that some enemies must be contained rather than merely defeated. The quarantine zones established 10,000 years ago stand as testament to the enduring vigilance required to protect humanity in a hostile galaxy. Whether they continue to hold against the pressures of the Dark Millennium remains to be seen, but the institutional memory of what they contain, preserved through fragmented records, specialized protocols, and the dedicated service of those who maintain the watch, ensures that the Imperium remains prepared should ancient horrors once again emerge from the darkness between the stars.